Welcome to our July 3rd regular joint quarterly meeting of the Board of Directors of Colorado River Water Conservation District and the Conservation District acting by and through its River Water Projects Enterprise. All the directors who are here, Director Catlin, I believe will be joining us by Zoom as he is able, as well Director Haas from Summit County. Staff and our guests, thank you all for being here. First item on our agenda is to look at the meeting agenda and objections. If there are any additions or changes to the agenda, it's an action-packed couple of days here with an interesting meeting with the state right in the middle of today. Any changes to the agenda?
None from staff, Madam President.
All right. We will then move to consent agenda. We have approval of minutes and acceptance of trades.
Stephanie's pointing out that perhaps a roll call would be appropriate.
Oh, sorry. Yes, thanks, Stephanie.
No worries. Alvin Vandenbrink.
Here.
Doug Monger.
Here.
John Ely.
Here.
Kathleen Curry.
Here.
Kathy Chandler Henry.
Here.
Mark Catlin.
Here.
Mark Rober.
Here.
Martha Whitmore.
Here.
Mike Richard.
Here.
Reeve Hazard. Here. Scott McGinnis. Here. Stan Winery. Beckley.
Here.
Taylor Haas.
Here.
I'm Gray.
Here.
Next up is the consent agenda. We have approval of minutes from 5 board meetings and acceptance of treasurer's reports, check registers, and draft financials. Any questions or comments on the consent agenda? Now, a motion to approve.
So moved. Second.
And moved and seconded by Whitmore and Director Vandenbrink. Thank you. All those in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion passes. Next up,
If I can just
yeah.
pause for a moment. I think we may have, if there's a board member here who is logged into the Zoom meeting. Is anybody on the Zoom is present physically in the room? No, we're just getting some feedback. So we'll keep an eye on that as we go forward. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Next up is the General Counsel's report on executive session. Here, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam President. I would make a recommendation at this time that the board convene into executive session pursuant to CRS section 24-6-402, read for B and E to discuss the items on your agenda, tab 3A.
Motion.
So moved.
Second. All right, moved by Richard, second by Whitmore.
And John, we'll come and get you if you want to hang out in the conference room upstairs. Thank you.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Before we get into executive session, for the record, I state that the matters to discuss in executive session are attorney-client communications, and no further recording of the executive session needs to be made. And as we are in executive session now.
Yes.
We open the doors.
Ready, Laura?
Oh, yes, recording was in progress.
Okay, I just didn't know whether folks.
Yeah.
had been
Yes,
brought
and
in.
everybody is in from the waiting room.
Thank you, members of the board, for the discussion this morning. During the executive session portion of the board meeting, the board discussed with council and with staff the items listed in Agenda 3A. There was one proposed item for discussion that for potential action. And if you would like, I could make a recommendation.
Yes, please.
Recommendation I would make is that the board delegate to the River District's Executive Committee the approval of the construction contract for the proposed office remodel project.
So moved.
Moved by Whitmore, second by Beckley. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Right, that is passed unanimously.
Thank you. There are a number of other items discussed in the General Counsel public report. If you have questions about any of those, please feel free to ask. Mostly Jason. And speaking of Jason, Jason has been with the River District for 15 years. And this certificate of achievement says this award is presented to Jason Turner in appreciation and recognition of 15 years of service. Your outstanding contributions of time, talent, and energy are gratefully acknowledged and deeply appreciated, with President Chandler Henry's signature and my scratch. But those words don't come close to conveying at all what Jason means to this organization, what he means to my ability to do my job, which I could not do without Jason, and frankly, for my friendship with Jason, which is really appreciated, and just thank you very much.
It's been an honor and a privilege to work for this board and the mission. It's been great, and to have such fantastic colleagues as well. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Ends the morning on a high note for sure. So thank you. We now have lunch, and we will reconvene here at 1 o'clock for a public session. We have one item left on executive session, which will take place between items number 7 and number 8 on the agenda. For a great lunch, Stephanie and your team got that for us. We appreciate it. We are resuming the third quarterly meeting of the River District on July 18th. We are starting this afternoon with public comment. Do we have any members of the public here who would like to make any comment on any item not on the agenda? See any in the room, anyone online? All right, with that, we will close public comment, and we want to give a warm welcome to some very special guests who are here with us today. We have Dan Gibbs, who is the director of the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. Kelly Romero-Heaney with him, who is the assistant director for the Department of Natural Resources. We have Amy Austin with CWCB, the section chief for interstate and federal and other water matters. And we have Becky Mitchell, who is our new sole job, I guess, the commissioner to the Upper Colorado River Commission from Colorado. We extend you a very warm welcome, and we're looking forward just to an open conversation with you this afternoon. And we thought we would just throw it to you and let you all make a couple of opening comments. We've got some questions that we've thought about in advance, and then we'll just see how the conversation goes. So who wants to kick it off? Yeah, thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for having us. We're really excited to be here. And we really hope that our conversation will lead to future conversations and really be an important nexus on issues that we discuss at the statewide level, that you know who the key players on my team are that work on water. But kind of before we talk about water, I just want to give you a big kind of overview of the DNR too, really fast, because if any of you have other side conversations or any issues you have that you want to raise with me out in the hall later, I'm happy to chat with you about, you know, whatever, wildlife issues or forest health and wildfire. But you know, we have 8 main divisions in the DNR. We have the Energy and Carbon Management Commission. We have and we manage about 51,000 active wells in the state of Colorado and over 300 operators for oil and gas. We have Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety. So that's all the aggregate gold mining, silver mining, extractive industries. We have State Land Board. We manage about 3 million acres of land for the benefit of K-12 education. Everyone's familiar with Parks and Wildlife. Hopefully you'll have a Parks Pass. How many of you? Everyone, we have over 40 state parks and over 300 state wildlife areas. We manage over 900 species. So we're very busy with that department. And then for water, of course, Division Water Resources, and I consider them almost the water police, but without guns, kind of, you know, making sure careful water administration is done throughout the state. We do, you know, a great job. And then Water Conservation Board, CABCB, of course, you know, the water policy setting body of the state. We also have Division of Forestry that's managed through the Colorado State University system. So we have an MOU with them and they work on our forestry needs. And then Colorado Avalanche Information Center. So as you all West Slopers know, making sure that whether you're on a snowmobile or skis or your pickup truck or car, that we get the best available information to people that are traveling. A quick snapshot on me. I'm a West Sloper, just like you all. Lived in Gunnison as a kid, and I have to tell a Scott McGinnis story, unfortunately. No, unfortunately. But my early years of kind of political experience, my mother used to be the elementary school principal in both Gunnison and Crested Butte. When Scott McGinnis was a congressman, he visited my mom's school. I was a senior at Western State and not really sure what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to work in some type of environmental policy. I wasn't sure if it was nonprofit or state or local or whatever it may be. And I'll never forget, Scott, my mom probably locked you in her office, but I got a call from my mom and she said, I have Congressman McGinnis on the phone and he wants to give you advice. And I'll never forget that, Scott. You're wonderful. This, you know how busy, especially a member of Congress, you were, but
I missed the part on the party registration.
Well, actually, then I had no idea what party affiliation was really. But went on to work and for another member of Congress, and that was a great experience. And then was served as a state rep with Kathleen Curry and county commissioner with many of you in the room. Really proud that I was a signer for Summit County for the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement. And so, so my roots run deep on the West Slope, and I've been in Summit County for over 20 years now, which is really hard to believe. But I really want to, kind of recognize that this past legislative session especially was quite challenging, I think, in many ways for the state as well as probably for the River District and staff and so forth. And the state wants to make a real strong effort, and that's, you're seeing my leadership team here, to really have dialogue, to have some tough conversations, and that's okay. There's going to be times when we agree and times we disagree. And what's really interesting for me is, if I had a tattoo, it'd probably be 970 area code. But in my role right now, it is looking at statewide, but I believe strongly in partnerships and collaboration. Many of you know, I've been a wildland firefighter for a long time, and I feel strongly that the best fire management is one that doesn't know the geographic boundaries of federal, state, private, or tribal lands. And when we look at water policy, like we need to work with everyone around the state, the River District, Southwest, Front Range, everyone. We all have to come together. And so anyways, that's why I really wanted to bring, my team with you. So I want to introduce you to my team. I'll kind of turn the mic over to Becky here soon, but I think you all know Becky Mitchell. So she's our full-time Colorado River Commissioner. Just hired you in that official role just a couple of weeks ago. So we're in the process of now interviewing for the director for CWCB. Becky has always hit the ground running on Colorado River issues and is a huge collaborator, to say the least. We have Amy Ostick. She is the head of the interstate section team within Water Conservation Board. And you've had that role for a couple of years now. Let's say previously you're in the Attorney General's office. And then Kelly Romero-Heaney, she's my assistant director for water within the Department of Natural Resources and Routt County, West Slope person as well. But she actually plays kind of a dual role for the department, where she plays a role advising the governor on water issues, as well as the Department of Natural Resources. And you can imagine that role can be challenging at times, because even within the DNR, Division of Water Resources may have a perspective, which they always do, of course. Parks and Wildlife can, Water Conservation Board, and so Kelly helps me navigate all those kind of challenging issues that I have internally. So that's my team, and we're really excited to be here. But before let me turn over to Becky in 1 second. I brought a huge stack of my business cards, and we're going to have a great dialogue, I know. But I want to be invited back, and my whole team does too. And so, I doubt we're going to, hopefully we'll scratch the surface on a lot of important topics, but we may not be able to cover everything. We'll see how much time you have. But I want to be invited back, and me and my team, have a commitment to you all to continue the dialogue. And we're going to agree to disagree, but let's not be disagreeable while we do that, right? We're all Coloradans, and we all care about this great state. So with that, let me turn it over to Becky. Thank you.
Thanks, and thank you, Dan, for the introductions. A lot has happened in the recent months, and so I really appreciate the invitation to be here to talk with you all. Like Dan, I hope this isn't the last time. I hope it's every time, if at all possible. And I think with what we have coming up in the next year, especially, but the next couple of years, I think it's important that these occurrences happen incredibly frequently. And I know you all meet quarterly and then sometimes more during legislative session, but I would like to make sure that we can update as frequently as possible. I'm always happy to be here. I'm always happy to talk directly with the board. And I want to create as many opportunities for that as possible. As you know, getting into kind of the Colorado River issues, last June, the Reclamation Commissioner announced the need to conserve 2 to 4 million acre feet of water in the Colorado River system. You're all familiar with the Upper Basin 5-point plan. So I'm not going to take the time to review that in detail, but I do want to say that while it hasn't been easy to implement, it has shown to our downstream neighbors and our federal partners that we manage ourselves. And it's a lot there's a lot of pain that it takes to conserve a very small amount of water. When we talk about, as an example, the System Conservation Pilot Program, less than 3,000 acre feet of that was in Colorado. But it also shows that at the same time, we're proactively part of the solution to the extent that we can be. And I believed it's helped us avoid, helped folks from looking upstream to solve all their problems. And keep the attention where it needs to be. I talked to some folks at lunch and talking about the focus continues to be where needs to be where the problem is, and that's in the lower basin. Many things have happened since that 5-point plan has come out. I want to highlight both the short-term and long-term planning processes going forward. First and foremost, I think keeping our eye on the prize is the renegotiation of the 07 guidelines. That for me cannot come soon enough. I think what we've seen from those guidelines is they haven't sufficiently protected the system, and we need to get on to doing better. So that is my primary focus. The draft EIS came out, and it's a mechanism to adjust the current operations and guidelines for Glen Canyon and Hoover Dams on the short term. It also provided options for the Bureau of Reclamation to adapt to potentially dry years over the next few years. The Bureau previously released that draft EIS that included 3 alternatives and a lot of components that we liked in those. 2 alternatives called for cuts in the lower basin states, but no additional actions from the upper basin. Since that's been released, the lower basin states put forward a plan to conserve 3 million acre feet over the next 3 years. They would like this plan to be implemented in lieu of any other alternatives in the draft supplemental EIS. Again, like I said at the time when that plan came forward, we still have not received sufficient information to fully analyze that proposal, but we hope to have more soon. That's why I'm hoping to get invited back so that we can talk about that when we have more of that information. We anticipate that Reclamation will issue a revised draft supplemental EIS and incorporating an analysis of this proposal later this summer and fall. And at that time, we can analyze how it performs against the others. Also being said, it's also, I want to keep our eye on another thing that the federal government is looking at, and that is the evaporation and system losses study, and that should be coming out sometimes in the fall. And I think that's also critical as we look to the future. And again, shifting our focus to the post-2026 negotiation, these 07 guidelines expire at the end of 2025. And if we want to avoid finding ourselves in this position again, it's critical that we take a really good, strong look at what has worked, and more importantly, what hasn't worked, and commit to doing better. My top priority recently has been working to develop a list of priorities and guiding principles that I like to reframe them as the irrefutable truths. That I think if you disagree with any of these, please yell out loudly when I say them, because I don't, I really truly believe that nobody can dispute these facts, that climate change is real and we must expect a drier, more variable future, that the upper basin and lower basins have equal apportionments to the river in perpetuity. Water users in the lower basin are not more important than our water users in Colorado and across the upper basin. These shouldn't be new, very new to anyone, but I'm going to continue through them because these are really my guiding principles. The lower basin overuse is unsustainable and puts the entire system at risk. Lake Powell and Lake Mead operations have to respond to actual hydrology, and Lake Powell releases must be determined by actual hydrology and protecting storage rather than Lake Mead conditions. This is called equalization guidelines and DCP. Lake Mead has been drawn down by lower basin overuse, and this has drawn Lake Powell into crisis as well. We must also preserve the Federal Reserve water rights for tribal nations. The tribal nations have water rights that they are entitled to use. Solutions for overuse in the lower basin cannot continue to depend on tribes' undeveloped Federal Reserve water rights. Finally, we must also defend attempts of curtailment in the upper basin. We have never been out of compliance with the compact, and the upper basin states regularly use far less than we are apportioned under the compact. That brings me to another critical point. We are not renegotiating the compact. It remains critically important to us because it guarantees those equal apportionments in the river to the river in perpetuity. And equally important, we have always been in compliance with the compact and not in danger of being out of compliance. We use 3 to 4 million acre feet less than our apportionment. As long as that is the case, we are going to defend our water rights holders, and I will not even consider taking actions or making statements that suggest compact administration and curtailment would be acceptable. Remember, we have an obligation not to cause the flows at Lee Ferry to drop below 75 million acre feet over a 10-year running average. We do not have an annual delivery obligation. And while we are prepared to defend that position, come what may, I will not roll over and concede we have any obligation that we simply do not have. I anticipate that the Basin States discussions ramping up in the coming months with the focus shifting to the post-2026 negotiations. The priorities that I've outlined, as well as our positions with respect to the compact, will guide me in those discussions. That being said, we still have conversations that need to be happening within the boundaries of our own state. I need to continue to be able to take Colorado's perspective with me to those tables. My staff and I will plan to conduct a roadshow, getting across the state to discuss our views on the law of the river, the priorities, and the current status of the negotiation. We'll also look forward to hearing feedback from across the state. One question for you all that I have is that what is the best way to directly engage with everyone at this table? I understand there's a perceived lack of transparency or communication, and I want to address this head on. There aren't a lot of secrets on the river. That is always said, that has been said. If you have a question, let's talk about it. I want to be fully and transparent and upfront with you. In terms of the immediate next steps, the notice of intent for the post-2026 guidelines dropped recently, and comments are due August 15th. We're working on outlining a response to this, and note these will likely be high-level comments focused on the scope and purpose of the post-2026 negotiations. Nothing in a comment letter will come as a surprise to you. It will echo the principles that I just outlined. That being said, if you want to discuss this in greater detail or coordinate ahead of the comment deadline, I'm happy to discuss that. What I also want to emphasize is that we are the strongest when we stand together as a state. Standing together as a state and as the Upper Basin when possible puts us in the strongest position we can on the interstate stage. I consider every bit of input I receive from across the state as I develop my strategy, and it's important that we hear from all of you. While I wanted to provide you on an update on what my team and I have been working on, my primary goal here is to really open the lines of communication directly with this board. We're not going to solve all the problems today, but I wanted to at least begin with this dialogue. I know you all have some questions, and we are happy to take those.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to kick things off, and I think it ties right in, Becky, to what what you just teed up. You all have often talked about speaking as one voice as a state, and you just now talked about a unified Colorado and getting input. So our question really is, are you open to input if it is really maybe some disagreement, some questioning, some looking at other perspectives, especially with the River District and with Southwest, who are specifically charged to help the state of Colorado with compact compliance and issues on the Colorado River. And how might we help you get that input? How are you looking? How are you thinking about that ongoing dialogue after today?
I think when we talk about maybe disagreeing opinions, I would say we're probably more in agreement than people would think. And I hope that that's actually the case. I think we don't learn when we're in an echo chamber. We learn when we're open to the different ideas. I can sit and talk to whoever I want that has the same opinion as me, and I will come out learning nothing. There's no new views. And I would ask the same. I urge, when talking to the folks in the state, I say, please gut check me. That is your role. Your role is to punch me in the stomach if this is a horrible idea, not literally. But I have tried to empower and surround myself, both on the internal side and the external side, of people that will gut check and say, here is the problem. Knowing that sometimes I have to make decisions that may not be fully agreed to. We try and strive to get agreement everywhere that we can. The River District, and I know you're speaking specifically about Southwestern Conservation District, are incredibly important partners in that. I think up until recently, I think there has been huge efforts in making sure that those voices are heard loudly and clearly. I would ask that this is a step to that, having these constant communications. and creating a larger tent, not the smaller tent. And so sometimes it's been difficult, especially when with the previous role as both the CWCB director and Colorado's commissioner. Sometimes it creates difficulty with that. Now with this new role, we can expand this tent. We have the time to expand it. We have the bandwidth to get all across the state and make sure that the tent is as large as it can be. We're going to continue to create opportunities for all Coloradans, including the West Slope water users, to engage, and especially as we work through these issues. My phone line's always open. Yesterday I was speaking to folks on the West Slope specifically. That was a phone call, and when I see 970, I pick it up. I don't have the tattoo, probably won't get it, but it's because I'm not getting any more tattoos. That being said, that when we see a call, the intention is to pick it up and to hear it. And we're planning ahead this upcoming fall. We're focusing specifically on a roadshow. We already have plans. This is the first of them. By the way, the official position started beginning of July. This is the first of the invites. I'm happy that it's the Colorado River District as the first one. I think it's an important first one. I think it's an important first step.
Great, thank you. Director Haas. Director Haas is joining us from Summit County today, so thank you for being here and jump in.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. First of all, thank you all for coming. I know this is a busy week for you all. Sorry, I'm not there in person, but I just wanted to have a comment and then a question. So my comment is just, this is a really important relationship, and I think your being here today is really kind of a critical first step to us trying to repair this relationship and figuring out how to better communicate, to continue to do our best to assume good intent, and when things don't make sense, to reach out and try to figure them out. So thank you for taking that first step. So my question is related to speaking of trying to figure things out, is related to the UCRC letter, the one about bucket 2. Because I will say it's pretty perplexing and confusing. So I'm trying to better understand and be curious about it. So the letter, I'll make a quick commentary and then I have a question specific to it. So a couple of a few of the concerns I have about the letter, and I know the district and many others have about the letter. And just to be clear, that the UCRC asking to run all of the bucket 2 money through the UCRC. And so, for one, it seems to narrow the legislation, which says public entity or agency. So we're narrowing it to one agency or entity, which doesn't seem to make too much sense. Second, it's adding another layer of bureaucracy when we're trying to really help the flow of money towards good projects. And so not quite sure why we would want to do that. The third issue, and a really big one, is capacity. Why I think it's confusing why we would want an agency of 3 to try to manage this huge amount of money. And so I'm curious about that. And then the last one is kind of, how do you all see bucket 3 fitting into this? Because I'm hearing from the Bureau that bucket 3 kind of fits into phase 2. The language is getting a little confusing, but just want to hear your thoughts on kind of what the reasoning was for that approach, because I'm assuming that this is coming from the 4 states. So understanding kind of what your thinking was, and are you all open to other ways of doing that? Assuming, once we hear your interests and your goals in doing this, maybe there's some other ways to accomplish those goals. Thank you.
And thank you for the comment and question, Director Haas. In clarification of that, the IRA bucket 2 funding contemplates the multi-year voluntary and compensated conservation efforts in both the upper and lower basin. It is our understanding that Reclamation would like to allocate these funds in exchange for measurable, and I think that's important, not only in this, but as we move forward, measurable benefits to the entire system. When it comes to coordinated efforts to conserve water for the benefit of the system, really that interstate coordination is critical. It helps us to ensure conservation efforts are consistent with the responsibilities of the UCRC as the administrative agency established by the 1948 Compact. It also helps us ensure that we are doing it all in a way that creates consistency between the states in the verification and monitoring of the water conserved that's pursuant to state law and existing authorities for the administration and distribution of water in each state, as opposed to somewhat of an uncoordinated effort that could potentially send water downstream simply to be released from Lake Powell to the lower basin. Also, one of the things that I want to highlight, when SCPP came out, there was some effort to directly contract with the feds. And so I think this system could potentially provide some control on speculation and help with the injury component. The involvement of all the upper division states agencies is also critical to protecting our water users. We need to be able to ensure that compliance with state law and avoid injury to vested water rights. We've asked, for those reasons, we've asked that the Bureau coordinate funding of Bucket 2 through the UCRC. That was not a solely Colorado request. That was consistent across all 4 upper basin states. There remains that Bucket 3, and I think you're right. The language is getting confusing and convoluted. That Bucket 3 is intended to be for ecosystem restoration projects. It's not focused on that coordinated water conservation efforts across the upper division states and doesn't require that same level of coordination. So we would not anticipate that Bucket 3 projects going through the UCRC and therefore did not request that. And quite frankly, when you talk about the resource allocation, I think we don't really want it either.
Can I just add, Taylor, sorry, Director Haas, apologies. It is not at all the intention to add another layer of bureaucracy to this. I think for all the reasons Becky outlined, we just want to make sure that we're doing this in a way that's aligned with upper basin perspectives, policies, strategies, frankly, when you think about how much water might be conserved in a program like this, the operations of Powell and Meade and things like that. We just want to make sure that we are doing it in the right way and being strategic about it from an upper basin wide perspective, but we certainly don't want to make it more complicated and don't want to hold anything up. I think SCPP, a lot of the complaints about SCPP were it rolled out way too fast. We had a lot of money and we were moving too quickly with it. So maybe we can find some middle ground there in terms of not adding that layer of bureaucracy, but making sure that we are having that check that I think is important from an interstate coordination perspective.
Yeah, thank you. And I know other directors have questions, so I won't hold up on this one. I just would say it'd be worth exploring other ways to achieve those objectives without inserting the UCRC into the middle of all this. So maybe there is a middle ground. I'm hopeful. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Haas. Director Whitmore.
I was glad to hear Director Gibbs talk about collaboration and really appreciate your comments about wanting to really enhance collaboration. Because I think many on this board have felt that there has been a terrible lack of cooperation and collaboration with the district. And some of the examples include the way the SCPP was rolled out, the fact that the district was initially told that we would have a real meaningful role in that, and then that was reversed. I think there have been concerns about, the role again in phase 2, as Commissioner Haas pointed out. And I think we're concerned as we move into the post 2026 guidelines, what role you see for the district and for Southwestern. Both districts are by legislation directed to be leaders on the Colorado River. And so I think we've had a lot of concerns about the lack of collaboration, and just kind of wondering what you see to change that moving forward.
So I think first and foremost, again, this is a step to that. I think direct communication with this board is going to be incredibly important moving forward. I also think that to make sure that you're hearing it directly from me in terms of what my intentions are, and as we try to move forward. When we talk about the System Conservation Pilot Program as one of those components of the 5-point plan, it's often been described as small, messy, and painful, and I can't overstate my agreement with that characterization. It wasn't easy for many reasons. The relationship with the district at that point was one of them. But at the end of the day, I think it did help show both our federal and basin states partners that we're willing to be a part of the solution, even though we didn't cause the problem. But there's not much that we can do in terms of what it takes to get water to save a system. It also showed that the amount of water available for conservation in the upper basin is very small. In fact, less than 3,000 acre feet came out of the System Conservation Pilot Program contracted in Colorado. So while we learned a lot through the implementation, we certainly know we can do some things better. We do believe that it helps show that we're trying to do our part. Again, as it relates to the approval process, this program is federally funded and then implemented by the UCRC through a funding agreement with the Bureau of Reclamation. The UCRC that ultimately made the decisions as to which proposals to be accepted through a rigorous engineering analysis pursuant to the criteria on the funding agreement with Reclamation. I think is important to recognize. State staff in all the upper division states helped review those proposals. And then Colorado staff coordinated with the Division of Water Resources to ensure that no injury to vested water rights would occur. Southwestern Water Conservation Board and the River District Board were provided with the same information that our board was provided with, the Water Conservation Board. And we're also invited to approve. There's also always the ability to approve a pilot program as a district approved conservation program. The same approval our own board was provided. This process is consistent with how the approval process went when the program was active 2014 to 2018. However, this go round, the CWCB and the district boards were given even more information than they were the last time around. Proposals were made public on the CWCB's website with personal identifying information redacted. This was done in an effort to protect the private information of water users who have not yet finalized the project activity or made any final determinations as to whether they would ultimately participate. We found it important to protect our water users' personal identifying information. I think it was also critical to recognize that had the river district criteria been followed, there may not have been any projects on the west slope that could have moved forward. We wanted to give the opportunity to water users to participate if they decided that it was the best for their own business decisions. So I think there is that local control component in here that water users are making their own decisions. Nothing was stopping the water users from within the district boundaries from sharing information with the river district about their plans to apply if they wanted to. Also, I want to make sure that you know those final contracts are now available on our website. Colorado is the only state that is doing that at this point. And that all being said, can we do better? Absolutely. Should we do better? Absolutely. I think about that with everything that we're doing on the Colorado River. We are initiating and have initiated through the UCRC essentially a lessons learned roadshow through the Upper Colorado River Commission. I believe that there is a meeting here on July 31st to talk about specifically what the River District advises in terms of how to do better. And so we took the letter that both the River District and Southwestern sent and have already kind of incorporated that into the documentation of ways to start thinking about doing better and even making that decision if we do system conservation pilot program again. On the same in the same vein, we got many comments about can we be more aggressive with system conservation? Can we do more? There were farmers and ranchers that said, please, 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 can we expand this program? And concern about not only the River District's criteria, but the state's and the UCRC's criteria. I think you all know there were many folks that would have liked to be a part of a program that I think go against the best interests of the state as it relates to speculation. And so that moving forward is definitely something that we need to be looking at. And how do we do that something to protect Colorado? I don't want to be a part of a program, whether it's system conservation or demand management, that the first intent isn't to protect Colorado. And we continue to learn, and we're going to continue to learn.
Thank you. Dr. Gray.
So, welcome. Thank you for your recap. I guess I'll direct this mainly to you, Becky. I'm not sure I can't say your title because I've been used to calling you.
You can call me Becky.
So thanks for your recap, and I appreciate your list of non-negotiables that you're going to push for. Particularly I'll pick out lower basin overuse and no curtailment in the upper basin. And I'm interpreting that being voluntary or mandatory, no curtailment in the upper basin. So you've touched on the SCPP and the 5-point plan. My question, and I really like what you just said, is that what's best for Colorado is more important than what particular interest or entities might be lobbying for, because we all, in politics, we all know that someone's always trying to get their own jam on toast, you know. And so my question is, with lower basin overuse and us not needing to curtail, and regardless of how it's implemented, whether it's, I know that's a big discussion we have, but regardless of how it's implemented or administered, why are we in the upper basin or Colorado in particular doing SCPP now or planning to do it in the future until the lower basin has permanent cuts in place? I mean, Commissioner recommended 2 to 4 million. They're dropping one temporarily. 3 million over 3 years. I'm saying 1 million per year temporarily with no permanence. That doesn't seem best to Colorado to me, for us to begin and to do this conservation when we don't have anything.
Thank you for that, Director Gray. And I think your statement was almost mirrored mine at the last UCRC meeting. And I think it's important to recognize that while we may not always agree on things, I often don't agree with the other upper basin states. That doesn't mean that relationship is not important or that their opinion is not valuable. What it means is that we have to look at this as the whole as much as possible. There's also disagreement on things like demand management in terms of what I think we should do versus some of what the other states would like to and how quickly they would like to move forward or not. So going back to the lessons learned piece and the implementation of SCPP in the next year, we need to get as much input on that as possible. The commissioners are looking at do we even do this? I've made my statements pretty clear about whether I think it's worth it or not. When we're talking about less than 3,000 acre feet and the sheer amount of pain specifically to the relationships that it caused for me is incredibly difficult. This last few months has not been enjoyable for me. Like some of my most valued relationships have suffered and because of SCPP. And so my eagerness to get to that again, I would say is waning. But that's not across the board. There are folks that would like to do this, and there are folks that are focused on the money piece of it and not just the bigger picture. I try to stay focused on the bigger picture, and I try to make sure that that message is getting out, not just across our own state, but to the other Upper Basin commissioners. And so the decision isn't made. These lessons learned document is incredibly important to that. But that needs to be heard. I need to be able to have the other Upper Basin commissioners hear what I'm hearing on the ground, not from my mouth, but from also yours. And so when you submit comments to the UCRC about that, I think it's incredibly important because that is not just my voice, it is our voice. And so if we do it again, the heavy if of it, we do know that it would have to start earlier. Like that decision would have to be made in the next couple months of whether we were going to do this again next year, because I want the time to be able to do it better. Are we going to do it perfect? Probably not. But are we going to try? Absolutely. Are we going to, but it's not a done deal. To be perfectly honest, I wouldn't want to step near this ever again if I had the choice myself. If I was only talking about my opinion on it and not folks on the ground that are wanting flexibility in their operations, not the other states. It was a lot of work and a lot was lost in this process. But that's only my opinion. And I have to take the opinions of folks that want flexibility in their operation. There's a lot of folks that want to be a part of the solution, that are saying there is a crisis on the ground and we want to do something. And so that's where we're at. Yes.
I just wanted to, just a point of clarification. I hope I'm not nitpicking, but the concept of involuntary curtailment that you referenced, I think everyone in this room, the state, everyone can agree that that is not warranted. There's no reason for it. That's unacceptable. But I want to draw a distinction between involuntary curtailment and voluntary conservation efforts, which perhaps there's space for a discussion about whether it makes sense under what circumstances if folks are doing it voluntarily and getting compensated on a temporary basis. So I just want to be clear that we view those as two very different things. In one space, there's room for a discussion, not a foregone conclusion. In the other space, it's not a discussion. There's absolutely no legal reason that we would be doing that right now. So I just want to be clear about that.
I can follow up. So and I agree wholeheartedly with the involuntary, of course. My question, I hope I was clear, isn't about how we do it. It's why are we doing it? And should we do it? Because this is a negotiation, and I know this is a public meeting. This is a negotiation in the Lower Basin. And I just feel like the information needs to be strong, and we, Colorado, needs to be strong to say you're the overusers, and I'm sorry, but your lakes are empty, and unless you make some permanent reductions, we're not going to start cutting from our already underallocated use and from our natural curtailment that we do on dry years because we don't have the reservoirs. That's I just feel like I don't hear that strong of a statement. I think I've heard you say it. And I think it gets said, but I don't think there's a unified Upper Basin position that says until this overuse in the Lower Basin is addressed permanently, we're not going to do it. That's just.
Thank you for that, Director Gray. And I think again, there's always going to be differences of opinion, and there's also I think there's this strong urge to do something. I think when you're hitting the front page of news like the New York Times and the Washington Post, people are saying, what part of the solution can I be? And I think that's that complicates things, right? Because what is right, what is required, and what we should, where the problem needs to be solved, we know. It's not rocket science that you cannot continually release more from Meade than is coming into Powell and think that you're not going to be dropping both those reservoirs. You cannot continue to release more than the system provides on an annual basis, 8 out of 10 years, and think that we can conserve our ways to their continued overuse. There's nothing that we can do that can solve that. But there are folks that want to be a part of some solution. And we also want to do better with our own water management if it serves Colorado. And that's where the voluntary, temporary, and compensated always come into play. This isn't there. We do not want to buy and dry. We do not want to take away from the viability of agricultural across the state. The focus on temporary, voluntary, and compensated was to provide another option for folks on the ground that are struggling in hard times. And I was on the ground a lot of the rough few years. And if you didn't see it and you didn't know it, I think it was unfortunate when you had Central Arizona Project come up that the rivers were flowing and the grass was green and everybody was saying it's so green. And when my friends come visit, they say it's so green here. That is not the case in general. It is not the case. You have the best farmers and ranchers here that know how to do it when it's good, and they know how to do it when it's not so good. And they built that flexibility into their system. We need to see that flexibility across the board. And so I agree with you on many of your points, but remember, we have to stand together with this. And so there are areas that we absolutely have to be open to flexibility, and there's local control pieces of things and that sort of thing.
So we want to try and get in a couple more questions. Director Curry has one, and then Director Catlin, if he is online, he's joining us from Montrose today. So we'll start with Director Curry.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate it. And thanks you all for being here today. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to one of a really easy topic, the task force. And this question isn't meant to rehash the merits of the legislation or the history or anything like that. It's a given, it's moving forward, the appointments have been made. And I've been thinking about how the task force could function. The Colorado River Task Force, Senate Bill 295, okay. How it could function in a way that would be helpful and useful for all of us, because a variety of entities are now going to be at the table talking about these issues, and everybody's likely to be pushing their own interests. That's a natural human thing. And I just wondered, from the state's perspective, if you had a desired outcome or goal or set of goals that things that you would like to see come out of this process. And before you answer that, what I was thinking about was how, when the task force kicks off, Madam Chair, wouldn't it be nice if the Attorney General's office came and spoke to the task force and said, here, we actually don't think we need anything from you guys, or maybe we do think you need to produce something, the task force. So if I were on that task force, I would say to the AG's office, is there legislation you want? Is there anything you want out of this, or no? And then I'd ask the state engineer the same question. Do you already have the authority you need to do what you need to do for the state of Colorado? And then I would ask you, Becky, and the CWCB, the same question. Is there something this task force should try to work on that you think you need to protect the interests of the state of Colorado? So I know that it's a little preliminary right now to ask this question, and maybe people haven't thought it through, but if there is anything that you could share with us at this point in terms of a desirable outcome or process even, it would be great to know that, because we're going to talk as a board about our involvement with the task force and, you know, what would be constructive and helpful and useful for the people we represent. And I just wondered if you had any reactions at this point.
I'll let Kelly answer this. She's my designee for the task force, and also just so everyone knows, Becky will be part of the tribal subcomponent of the task force. Just so everyone knows. Okay. Kelly, why don't you kick it off and we can all jump in?
Yeah, sure. And Director Curry, thank you so much for that question, and thanks so much for letting us leave like all of the history and everything behind, because at this point, you know, we've got the task force formed. And I will say that as the designee for Director Gibbs, I'm really excited to come to the table with the other task force members. With respect to what are our goals or, you know, hoped outcomes of the task force, I think because we've got multiple members of the task force sitting here in the room, we have to be really careful about how we talk about that work. Just to honor open meetings laws and not step outside of that. So probably won't get into that today, but I just will say that I'm eager to serve. I also note that I served on one of the work groups, the demand management work groups that the CWCB facilitated in 2019 and 2020. I was representing West Slope local governments and evaluating economic impacts. I know several of you in this room also served on those work groups, those demand management work groups. It'll be interesting to kind of dust off some of that work that we did and see, you know, how it applies today. And then I guess the other piece too is we anticipate that conversation to touch multiple divisions within DNR, which is part of why Director Gibbs designated me. As he noted earlier, you know, we've got several divisions that work on water. And so I play a role internally trying to cross-pollinate. And that way I'll also be in a position to help bring subject matter experts to the task force as well as requested.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to Mark Catlin, and then our final question is going to come from Director McGinnis. Director Catlin, you're on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not really the most computer literate, so I'm sitting here in Montrose because I needed to be here, and I'd like to be there with you so I could see we could look each other in the face and in the eyes. My question is in regards to Senate Bill 270 last session. It was a priority for DNR, but it underwent a lot of extensive amendments and a lot of work to reach something that people could vote for to pass. I was one of those, even though I sponsored that bill. We narrowed its focus and reach before it even got to the legislative floors. Those were consensus amongst the shareholders and the people that caring about the state of Colorado. And now I'm hearing that there is a real push to write a more expansive bill to be offered this next session in regards to 270, use it as a doorway, I guess. Can you talk about what the department's proposing for the next session in regards to 270?
Thank you, Director Catlin, Representative Catlin. You're really appreciated. Of course, we really appreciated your sponsorship of Senate Bill 23270. Just for context, that was the stream restoration bill that that just offered clarity that certain minor stream restoration activities wouldn't cause injury and wouldn't be obligated to go to water court or get a plan of augmentation. And I think that was a real win for Colorado. It also was a real win for our communities that are dealing with wildfire runoff, communities that had to deal with the 2013 floods. So fire and flood recovery was covered under that, as well as some of the great work that Gunnison is doing on ephemeral streams there in their area. So we were thrilled to get that passed. With respect to the conversation going forward, we heard a lot from stakeholders that there was a lot of, we weren't quite to the point where we had that shared understanding of what it is we were talking about when it comes to stream restoration projects that are reconnecting channels and floodplains, you know, allowing water to overtop its banks like it historically would have before a channel was impacted by, you know, whatever historic land use practice or whatever else. And so I think we recognize that we just need a little time to have some conversation. We need to get some boots on the ground, actually looking at streams, looking at projects. And so we're just kind of waiting to see where our stakeholders at, where water districts are at, to see what's the best path forward. We're also, you know, looking to, you know, some of our leaders at the legislature, like Senator Cleve Simpson, who, you know, had committed to continue this conversation to see what's really needed. So at this point, Director Catlin, we're committed to that conversation, waiting to see how that goes before we decide whether we need to move forward with additional policy.
So let me follow that up with, you are considering running a bigger, expansive bill?
At this point, we haven't made any decisions as far as what to move forward on.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
And just as a quick follow-up, you know, we actually just submitted yesterday our proposed budget for the DNR and some legislative concepts, and it's part of a process where the governor's office and everyone kind of looks at it, and OSPB, and so it kind of kicks off a process on what we can move forward with and what we can't, and so it's really early stages of even just concepts of thinking like what we need to work on. So
thank you. More to come. Yeah. All right, thanks. And Dr. McGinnis, you're back and clean up here.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Of course, you know the makeup of the board. Representative Gibbs, you know the importance of, as Becky says, boots on the ground and hearing from people. Being in this district, I'll talk about my case specifically. I heard a lot during the drought and about how we're going to respond to this. And I heard a lot of people that were suspicious that the River District, which they consider their guardian angel, somehow was going to get diluted in the process, or we were going to get overtaken, or the state of Colorado was going to use a lot of money to come over and acquire water rights, and so on and so forth. And you know, I told these people, I said, we've got good, capable people that I know personally. Becky was specifically you, only personally, but I come to respect you on the roles you play and so on. And you know, some of your comments, I just wrote down your conversation, why I think my high thoughts of you, you know, justification. When we turn around to our communities, and I talk to people and I say, no, we're not going to be diluted. We're going to play a part next, an important part. We have a statutory responsibility. We're a very capable board. We're not heavily staffed, but the staff we've got. By the way, I don't know how you're going to do this with 3 staff with all that money. Oh. But nonetheless, you know, you're in good hands, so to speak. And like you say, your guiding principles, this is what gave me reassurance. Your word, which was real important in Las Vegas, wasn't sure because where my seat was, but it was almost like you got tears in your eyes when you talked about keeping your word with the Native Americans. It was impressive. Nothing will come as a surprise to you. And then lessons learned. I've kind of learned a lesson. I want to read it to you. So this is the paragraph of the letter you sent. After I was out there, and some of my colleagues, I'm speaking for myself, as a part of the commitment, this is from you, Rebecca, you know what I'm about to say. As a part of the commitment, in the event the source of water in place of the beneficial use, the prospective applicant's SCPP project is located within the boundaries of the district, enrollment in the SCPP will be subject to approval of the application by both the Colorado Water Conservation Board and the district. Becky, you didn't keep the commitment. And now I'm faced with a situation. I mean, I've got constituents that don't believe me. They don't believe me that in the background, your team's figuring out how to buy water rights. that the river districts can be shoved to the side, that you kind of congratulate yourselves for the work that you've done this last time with only 3,000 acres. But, you know, I'm in a quandary. I'd like to kind of know if we're going to do another round in 2024 of the SCPP, where's the river district? What part are we going to play in it? And what about that commitment? Doggone it. You had me sold. But I'm trying to talk myself. Scott, it's a lesson learned. You dealt with the East Slope before. You dealt with Denver Water Board for decades. You learned a lesson, but sometimes it took me a while to learn it. What am I missing, Becky?
Well, I think, and thank you for your honesty on that.
You said you didn't want an echo chamber. You don't.
No, and I don't, and I appreciate it. Director McGinnis, sorry. Almost called Scott. Yeah, you can. I've been called worse than my first name.
I say respect.
I think it's important. I think you're right, and that, like I said, and I mentioned with the SCPP, that was one of the hardest moments that I've had in my career, and it's been a long career in Colorado water. And my focus has been to avoid buy and dry, to really preserve ag across the entire state. We got ourselves in a quandary when the criteria that the River District developed was different than what the state had. It came to a place where it was difficult decision making and how to do this. And I mentioned this as we talked about the SCPP, there may not have been any projects allowed. And at the same time, were folks that were calling and saying, we want to do this. We absolutely have to do this. We have to pull out because we may not be approved by the River District based on what their criteria was. And so this was a hard one for me also, Director McGinnis. Like this one was.
Commitments are hard sometimes.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Trust. Yes. And so I hear what you're saying, and I think it's important to recognize that commitments are made on both sides. And this one was. I probably did not look at what the full picture of what could happen, and put those place marks out there beforehand. I also think had we been at the level that we're hoping to get to, where we're in constant communication, not with the entire board, and able to have the conversations, not just as the fires happen, but saying, hey, we may be making criteria that's opposite, or that is more stringent than yours. What do you think about that? Like, I think we need to be talking to the board on a more regular basis, because had I been in that board meeting, we may not be in this place. And so I think what's important to me is that we find ways to avoid this situation. I like Director Gray said, I'm struggling with whether this thing was worth it or not. And I'm not touting the 3,000 acre feet like it was a win. I don't believe that I'm trying to find the goodness in what came out of it, which is really hard. And that the goodness that I found was that it was a struggle to get that done, and that exemplified why a program like this we have to really think about. And
so what
the
role
issue,
what role do we play going forward?
I think we have to go. I think we have to go through this lessons learned piece of things and look. One of the commitments that we talked about at the UCRC was that how do we create a transparency from the beginning? One of the issues was that we didn't let the applicants know that at the beginning of the process when they applied, that all of their information.
With the district.
Yes.
What's our role together? How are we going to be partners?
I think we all have some work to do on how we are partners.
And from your end, how's that work?
I
thought I heard from your end.
Yeah.
A year ago.
Yeah, I'm here.
Great, and I think I'm gonna jump in and have Andy say a few words related and maybe kind of put some closure here.
Just two follow-ups. No, Becky, we had 3 public meetings while developing our criteria for system conservation pilot project. Your employees were in attendance at all 3 as the executive director of the CWCB. Your AG's office were in attendance at all 3. At all 3, we opened it up for public comment and we didn't hear a word. I didn't get a single call from you. Your staff knew, you knew what criteria we were developing. The state never developed any criteria. You had a contract. We never saw any criteria whatsoever in a public fashion, in a transparent manner by any appointed board, any elected board, anybody at DNR. We never saw it. It wasn't published. You had a contract with the Bureau of Reclamation that the UCRC negotiated back in November that had some very vague criteria. That wasn't the state's criteria. That was the UCRC's criteria. So the idea that we didn't communicate about that, I apologize that I didn't call you or send you a draft personally. I admit I should have done that, okay? But the rest of this, we held it in public because you said we would have a role in reviewing that. As a government agency, we can't act in an arbitrary and capricious manner. We need standards under which we review things and accept or reject them. If we're going to review specific project applications, as you said we would be, we needed criteria. Yes, we could do better in our communication talking about it, but we did that in public meetings with your staff and your AG's office present and never heard a word until you told me we were done. That's it, okay? Second question, that wasn't a question. The actual question though is when you look at the Bureau of Reclamation, go back to Taylor's question at the beginning. She said, hey, we're having a hard time understanding the phase 2 comments that all the money has to go through the UCRC. Right? Well, I'm looking at the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation pre-solicitation notice. It says that they have the money for phase 2 projects that could fall into 3 general categories. One of them is the category that you mentioned, which actually makes sense that the states want to control that, which is system conservation and efficiency projects that achieve verifiable multi-year reductions. That is exactly what I think you spoke to. And I understand that you want that to be a system statewide approval. It makes sense. The state, DWR has to be involved. The state would assume run that with hopefully some local input and review. But you go down and there are 2 more bullet points. One of them is ecosystem habitat restoration to address issues directly caused by drought. That's not a verifiable reduction in consumptive use like demand management or system conservation. That's a project that say maybe could preserve a water right that's an in-channel water right that would help sustain the flows of the Colorado River. And what I see in this is your UCRC comments say that money doesn't go through public entities as the IRA bill says it does, because that's actually what the language in the IRA says it does, because you know that Michael Bennett pushed to have that in there. And so how is it that it's okay for the UCRC to demand that that money goes only through the UCRC or through and instead of through public entities that may have throughout our state great ways of preserving those kind of flows in our rivers for our ecosystem?
Andy, I can take a bit of a stab. I'll start with the last question that you raised, your comment and question. I don't believe it is the intention of the UCRC to have a direct role in the ecosystem restoration. We've called it bucket 3. I think there was a little bit of confusion in the way that Reclamation rolled out the notice and that they were not very clear about what they
calls that phase 2. Your letter from the UCRC calls it phase 2.
And the IRA, language in the IRA divides it into 3 different buckets. So we thought about bucket 3, and we've been clear with Reclamation about the fact that that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at upper basin conservation efforts that need to be coordinated by the state. So I think we're talking potentially about different things.
Well, we look forward to clarifying that with you with the Bureau, because that's not what the UCRC letter says. And we would love to clarify that, because it is the letter from the UCRC says phase 2 all should come through the UCRC, and if it doesn't, you will strongly oppose it. And that's phase 2 is the language that is used in the notice of intent that includes the provision that I just.
I understand what you're saying, and I understand where I think there has been some confusion created. We were looking at the language of the IRA, which very clearly divides these pots into 3 different buckets, and we were looking at bucket 2, and that's how we've been conceptualizing it. That's how we've been thinking about it. The ecosystem restoration, I can't remember the exact language. Bucket 3 that's not what we're trying to talk about here. So I think it would be very helpful to have some clarification there. I think we could all just benefit from some open communication on that point.
Well, we've tried to communicate. I called Commissioner Mitchell previous to that letter from the UCRC for clarification. Amy has talked to you. I know that. We are doing our best to communicate.
I had a great conversation with Amy about it.
I understand, and I appreciate that. But nonetheless, the letter from the UCRC says all of phase 2 money must go through the UCRC. This is where we need some clarification, and I'd love to cooperate with you to clarify it for the Bureau.
And I think this is a key, example of how we can communicate better and just, talk through these things. And I'm hoping we can work this out. And I also, again, I think we're on the same page here. So I don't want to create a conflict where there's not one, if we can avoid it.
I appreciate it.
And I did just want to speak a little bit to I know it was not a question. I know it was a statement. I know we're not going to resolve all these issues today, but the criteria issue with the SEPP. I do want to clarify that there were criteria posted on UCRC's website, since it is a program that was facilitated through an agreement with the UCRC and the federal government. It was the UCRC that was administering the program. So there were criteria posted on UCRC's website, but one of the big lessons learned already is we need to do a better job of getting that information out there. We need to make sure that we are actively communicating with water users and potential participants, if we do this again, about what those criteria are and what the expectations are. And maybe we can even talk about that, a little bit more openly before that all rolls out, before that's all developed. And I think the July 31st meeting is one effort to do that, to make sure that we're more on the same page this time, if it does happen to go forward again. So I did just want to clarify, there were criteria out there, but we could have done a much better job. The CRC, all of us could have done a much better job at getting those out into the world.
Thank you.
Well, we've kept you over your time. I really appreciate it. And I just want to say, as uncomfortable as this is, it's kind of where we needed to get some things out in the open. We appreciate your willingness to hear us say that. And it's, I think, being at this stage is like when you go 4-wheel driving and you're down in the pit, and you're going to get up there on the summit. It's going to get better, but it's pretty tough right there. And I think that we have this opportunity now to have a stronger relationship and work on things together. So appreciate you being here.
Can I just do one cleanup point really quick? I apologize. I just wanted to address something that Director Curry raised earlier that I think is a really important point as the task force kicks off, which is that question of, is this the right tool at the right time? Is a potential demand management program really the right option for the state right now? And I don't want to speak on Becky's behalf or on behalf of our board, but I do want to be very clear that that's really an open question, that is not a foregone conclusion. That is not something that I think anyone is ready to make that feasibility finding today. And I really don't want to get ahead of our board, but I just want to be very clear that that's a critical first question in thinking through those difficult issues. Is this the right tool at the right time? So I wasn't going to answer that question, but I just want to say that I don't think that any of us view that as something that is a foregone conclusion.
And I'd just like to thank everyone for your time. We really appreciate this opportunity to be here. I don't know exactly how often your board meets. I would have loved to be on this board. On a side note, when I was a county commissioner, we couldn't agree, so we sent our county manager. But seriously, we do want to be available. And Kathy, I echo your thoughts too. Sometimes they're difficult conversations, but I brought a stack of my business cards, my cell phone. Like, what we want really you to do is, like, we want to be invited back. We're happy to show up for your next meetings. If you have questions, give us a ring. We're happy to have these conversations with you as a board and staff. So whatever you feel is appropriate, but we just do want to be available. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And you are welcome to stay to hear the risk study. We've kept John Karen waiting all day long.
Another one for
All right, everyone, deep breath, stretch. John, thank you for your patience.
Absolutely.
We appreciate you being here. See, DK, are you going to introduce this session?
I'd be happy to.
All right, thank you.
And I'll keep it extremely brief by introducing Dr. John Karen, who we've worked with for more than 10 years. So long that I can't recall. We're firing up his slide deck. And, you know, by way of introduction, this study should not be new to this board, maybe to some individual board members, because it's really a continuation of something that's been going on, trying to assess the issues with Colorado River as really represented at Lake Powell, and also to water users. What is the risk of, to be blunt, what's the risk of compact curtailment on an involuntary basis? And so that's what John will be talking about. And I could probably leave it there. And really appreciate you coming over.
Terrific. Sure, this is right. Well, thank you everyone, board and staff of the River District. Nice to see you all. Usually I like to come over and say it's nice to be out of the heat on the Front Range, but I don't know if that's the case right now. It's pretty hot over here too. So in any case, a little bit of background. You know, this is an update on work that's been going on for quite a few years. It really has its roots back, in some sense, back in 2012 with Reclamation's Colorado River Basin study, and work that the UCRC was doing at the time, looking at the risks to the upper basin, looking at potential future supply shortfalls, looking at shortages, looking at all sorts of risks in the basin. And I think that at that time, the River District and Southwestern really wanted to understand more about how those risks might translate into the state of Colorado itself, right? So not just looking at Lake Powell, but looking at what's going on within the state, and really try to drill down into some of those details and understand more about what all of these things could mean for the state of Colorado and its water users. So this slide, just a little bit of a timeline. The first risk study we did back in, finished in 2016, really was started, I think, in late 2014. But there are other actions that have been ongoing and related, the Water Bank Work Group, economic risk study, demand management stakeholder group, et cetera. So this is all part of sort of that vein of trying to be as transparent as possible and really get as much information out to as many people as possible about what's going on in the basin and what it might mean for the state of Colorado. So a bit of an outline. I'll go back and talk about phase 3 briefly because we've updated a lot of the results from phase 3, and I'll talk about that both within the state of Colorado and basin-wide. The first of those within the state, some work that we've done using the CDSS tools, StateMod, to estimate pre and post compact consumptive uses in the state. And we also took a look at interannual and subbasin variability. And for those of you who are familiar with what we did back in phases 2, really in phase 3, some of this will be familiar, but this is really revisiting some of that based on new information. And then the second big piece that I'll talk about is updates to what we call the big river risk, what's going on with Lake Powell, Lake Mead, Lee Ferry flows, those sorts of things. And a couple of things we'll touch on there are trans mountain diversions, particularly with respect to
forecasts of future growth, not just of Trans Mountain diversions, but also just upper basin wide growth that is forecast. And then look at Lakes Powell and Mead and Lee Ferry. I assume somebody else is taking care of that. Thank you. Okay. So this is just a quick summary. You can't leave yet, but this is the executive summary. Hydrology still matters and is still the #1 indicator of system health. That's probably not a surprise. Increasing demands in the upper basin do increase the risk of potential shortages, curtailment volumes, the need to do something. What that something is obviously subject to debate. But I think it's pretty straightforward when you think about it. As anywhere, if you're consuming more water, there's less water going downstream. We all know or have shared concerns about continuing to be in compliance, and we are very much in compliance with the compact, as Commissioner Mitchell said. But in any case, we do want to have that conversation and be aware of the implication of growth in the upper basin. What I'm going to take a look at Trans Mountain demands. I'll talk about those in some detail. In particular, because of the state's schedule that they and the UCRC are using to model future conditions in the basin. And then also want to talk briefly at the very end about Lake Powell and what it means to, as Reclamation has suggested, maintain elevation 3,500 or really maintain the ability to generate hydropower. And that under the current operational guidelines and assumed continued aridification this year notwithstanding, that really puts a significant burden on the upper basin. And it really highlights the need for the upper basin to be intelligent and push for a more equitable way to manage the system that doesn't place the burden on the upper basin. So dive in a bit. In phase 3 of the risk study, we looked at a couple of different things and touch on those briefly. There were some simplifying assumptions that were made as part of that analysis that overestimated what we were reporting in phase 3. It overestimated total consumptive use in Colorado. It overestimated pre-22 compact use, consumptive use, and those fixes really that we identified and made compelled us really to go back and revisit this analysis. So I'll show you just a comparison. Pre-compact, and here again, I want to make sure we're being clear. There's obviously some dispute about what pre-compact really means, but for our purposes, we're talking about water rights before 1922 or after 1922. In phase 3, our modeling showed about 1.6 million acre feet of pre-compact consumptive use. Phase 4, because of the changes and really, I would say, errors that we had identified in the modeling, it's been reduced about 1.3 million acre feet. And I think that really is more consistent with kind of conventional wisdom and what people for a long time have considered to be approximately the amount of water that was pre-compact water in the state. You can see that the post-compact water went up a little bit, but overall the total consumptive use went down. And again, this is really a function of some of the modeling assumptions that we weren't fully aware of at the time with state mod, but we really feel like these numbers are more indicative of and more accurate with respect to the water rights in the state and the west slope. So just a little bit of an update to that. You know, and overall, less consumptive use overall, and certainly less pre-compact consumptive use than we had previously seen. Diving into the details a little bit. this is by basin, and we break this out by basin simply because that's how State Mod does it. So each of these basins really, with the exception of the Upper Colorado piece, which we've further split out into in-basin and TMDs. But each of these basins is really a modeled basin in CDS's State Mod model. Over on the far right, I've just circled that to highlight kind of the percentages of post-compact depletions. That those same two columns in the blue are the pre-compact depletions. And you can see those percentages have changed a bit from what we had reported. Perhaps most significantly, it looks like as a percentage, the Trans Mountain diversion percentage is quite a bit lower. If you look at it volumetrically, that amount really didn't change a lot. What's really going on is that the amount of post-compact depletions that we see in other basins because of the change in the modeling are actually higher than what we were seeing in phase 3. So, and I'd be happy at any point to go back and talk through this when we get through it. So, and do stop me if you have questions. Well, so on average, we may have post-compact consumptive use of about 1 million acre-feet a year. But if you look, that doesn't really tell the whole story because there's a lot of interannual variability. So if we assume 1 million acre-feet of post-compact water over this period, this particular period that I'm showing here, you can see that the amount from year to year varies quite a bit. And so we wanted to take a look and understand a bit more about that variability. And I'll not spend a whole lot of time here, but each of the basins is shown there as a separate color. One of the things you note right away is that in those dry years, the amount of post-compact consumptive use is significantly lower than the average, right? And that makes sense, right? In a dry year, you would expect there to be less water available overall, and those junior water rights are going to be less and less likely to be satisfied. Yeah, Director Curry.
Is it okay if I ask a question? Okay.
Sure.
I noticed the data, just the period of record ends in 2013. So
yes.
We didn't go past that.
Well, yeah, and unfortunately, that is the most recent data sets that we have for State Mod that cover all of the basins.
Really?
So it hasn't yet been updated. Yeah.
10 years old. So it does it reflect the drought conditions we faced up until this year?
Well, it certainly reflects everything starting in 2000. I mean, you can, two of the very bad years, 2002 and 2012 are included there. Certainly you would expect if you, and when we're able to look out beyond 2013. And we will actually look at some data more recent, just not for State Mod. But certainly you'd expect that, I think the takeaway here is just that when it's dry, you don't have as much consumptive use overall. And we saw that certainly last year in the basin. And furthermore, if you're talking about compact related issues and pre and post compact water, you're not going to see those post compact users getting anywhere near their average amount of water.
Except the TMDs.
Yeah.
Well, actually, if you look at the green there, that very short TMD line is reflective of what the TMDs actually consumed in that year. And I think this is a good point to bring up because they may well have stored water previously, right? But in 2002, there was very little either direct flow or storage that those TMDs were able to take in that year. Sure, they took water out of Dillon and Northern took water across the divide, but that was water that, for purposes of sort of what I would consider basin depletions, those depletions happened in previous years when that water was put into storage. So they weren't really able to realize any appreciable water in those years.
So they just banked they used what they banked.
Sure, just like anyone who's got storage, they were relying on storage heavily in those years, in those very dry years. So the variability is to your point, if you actually look at, and this is an exceedance curve, but I think the way to look at this is just to say that the variability by basin, you can see that the TMDs have by far the highest amount of variability. So the amount of water that's available in a particular year for the TMDs is most variable. You know, and they are really the most subject because they're primarily junior. So they're very susceptible to variations in hydrology. Zooming in a little bit more on this, the dark blue is the San Juan, the light blue is in basin upper Colorado. And then you've got the Gunnison, the white, or the white. And I think really the message here, you know, you think about the Gunnison shows some variability, you know, from 120 down to about 90,000, but those basins where there's really a lot of water relative to the demands for that water in the basin show fairly low variability, right? I mean, we all know the Yampa has until recently really never had administration. And so even in dry years in the Yampa, most of the users are getting their water rights satisfied. And, you know, and you can see the San Juan, there's a higher degree of variability. So really depends on the basin you're in as to how much and how often you might expect there to be an impact to those more junior water rights. So just a quick summary and takeaway from this piece of the presentation. Again, the numbers there showing pre and post compact use. Post compact consumptive use really varies quite a bit between 700,000 and 1.4 million acre feet a year, depending on hydrologic conditions. As we've discussed, the majority of this is due to Trans Mountain diversion, storage, and deliveries. But the San Juan and in-basin upper Colorado are also fairly significantly impacted by hydrologic variability. And as I've mentioned already, the Yampa White and the Gunnison generally are less influenced by those really extreme hydrologic years.
It says summary at the top. Is that also just through 2013?
Yes. Yes. Okay, so that was a kind of a review and a rehash of what we had done in part of phase 3. I want to now turn and talk about Big River, not entirely leaving the state of Colorado, but using a different tool to look at some of the questions that that are important to the River District. So over the last year and a half or so, I guess almost 2 years now, Reclamation has spent a good deal of time and effort updating its Colorado River simulation system. It's a model that, or one of the models, I should say, but the primary model that they use for doing their long-term planning. So this is the model that'll be used for renegotiation of the interim guidelines. But in large part due to comments that were provided that came from the state of Colorado, a number of changes were made to that modeling tool. I think it's worth noting that, you know, that modeling tool, and I'll refer to it as CRSS, but it was really developed originally as a tool to simulate the operation of Reclamation's big reservoirs. So looking at the CRISP units, Flaming Gorge, Aspinall, Navajo, Howell, and then the lower basin reservoirs. Over time, it's been asked to do increasingly more complex things, look at questions that were never really intended for it to be looked at. And Reclamation, I think, has been challenged to sort of keep up with those requests. But a couple of things that were really lacking, I think, in that model was the ability to look at upper basin depletions in an accurate way. And there are really two pieces to that. One is the way that the model simulated in-basin shortages in water supply. Because of the very coarse granularity of the model, it didn't do a good job of say, simulating tributary shortages during really dry years. The other thing that it didn't do was it didn't simulate Trans Mountain diversions very well. And that's, you know, that includes the Front Range of Colorado. It also includes the Wasatch Front in Utah. And it includes, to some extent, diversions through the San Juan Chama project into New Mexico as well. But really the Utah and Colorado pieces were lacking in the representation of Trans Mountain diversions. So, so one of the big things that was changed in the model is that a storage reservoir was added to represent Trans Mountain diversion storage. Really, that's Dillon and Granby and Homestake. And it separated out that those water users from direct flow Trans Mountain users, such as Moffett. The other big piece that changed in the model was this ability to simulate shortages within the basin. So there is now a much better representation, albeit not perfect, but a much better representation of how shortages are realized in the upper basin, particularly during dry hydrologic years. All of that led to the elimination, or more or less the elimination of bias that we were seeing at Lake Powell. And this is something that was really important because if you looked back and compared the model to reality, the model was showing a much higher risk of bad things happening at Lake Powell than we think was really accurate. It was overestimating depletions in the upper basin and therefore underestimating water going into Lake Powell, which in turn was exacerbating the risk, or the modeled risk, that we were seeing. So all of that is good, and all of that, again, because of these model updates, we wanted to go back and revisit some of the questions that we've been looking at in the previous versions of the risk study. One important note that I do want to mention with respect to the Trans Mountain diversion analysis in Colorado. So one of the things that is and has always been tricky in any modeling, I think, of TMDs is the fact that, you know, in any given year, there may be very different conditions on the west slope and the east slope. So you may have a situation where it's you know, dry on the west slope and wet on the east slope, and there may be relatively little need to take water across from the west slope to the east slope, and obviously the opposite can happen. But one of the things that was implemented into CRSS was this notion of a sort of an east slope metric. So if it's wet on the east slope, the demands in the model are going to be reduced, and they won't be as high as they might otherwise have been. And so this sort of east slope indicator, if you will, is used in the modeling when we model the 2020 demands. And I'll talk about this, I'll get into some more detail here. But one thing I do want to mention is that when we do this forecast of future demand, so we look out 30 years, and when we look at that 30-year forecast, we don't use the east slope limitations on TMD demands. And the reason for that really is because I think that the east slope is in the process really of increasing infrastructure, you know, the Gross Reservoir enlargement, Northern Scott projects on the Cougar, additional reservoirs. So there will continue to be a growth in demand, yes, and there will also be an increase in the ability of the east slope users to take more water when they can and put it into storage on the east slope. So just a little additional detail on some of the modeling. We'll talk about that more here. So some of the key questions. How do Trans Mountain diversion demands impact the state of Colorado? And how does it impact the river as a whole? How do increased demands in the upper basin as a whole impact Lake Powell and the rest of the Colorado basin? and a bit about how that risk has changed since phase 3 of the risk study. So we're going to try and answer those. A little bit more about the TMDs, and I don't want to make it sound like we're picking on the TMDs, but if you look at the forecasted increases in demands in Colorado, and this is using the state of Colorado's data that they provide to the UCRC, 70 to 75% of the forecast increases in Colorado consumptive use over the next 30 years are in fact Trans Mountain diversion increases. So it is by far the largest single contributor to future demand increases in the state. There's a significant chunk, about 110,000 acre feet of what they call known export demand increases. The 3 largest of those are Windy Gap and Moffett, and the Eagle River Whitney Reservoir projects. And you can see there on the left, those 3, based on their own analyses, those 3 projects on average will deplete about 85,000 acre feet out of the river each year. And obviously there's some variability with that, as we've shown, because they're not going to get that every single year. There is another potential projects, another 75,000 acre feet of potential projects that are sort of undefined, but that are a placeholder for potential additional export out of the Colorado River Basin. And again, this is just detail from the UCRC future depletion demand schedule. And you see, I've circled the export piece there. You'll see that there's some small forecasted increases in energy, in mineral, other M&I types of activities, and a very small increase in ag as well. Okay, so we're evaluating both the TMDs and the demands as a whole, sort of what we call the current demand levels, and also at 2050 demand levels. We're going to do that using CRSS, and this is Reclamation's recently released updated model. One of the things I think obviously everyone's wondering if we're now in year 23 of the drought. This year notwithstanding, we are still in a drought. Basin-wide, there still is a water deficit. Is it the new normal? I don't know, but certainly I think we want to take a look at what the future could look like, under a variety of really dry conditions. So we're going to look at 3 different potential hydrologic futures. One is, and I think most of you are familiar with this terminology, but the stress test hydrology, which is really 1988 through 2020 now, or 2022, which is about a 13 million acre foot average since 1988. We're also going to look at an 11 million acre foot future and a 9 million acre foot future. So average flows of 11 and 9 million. It doesn't mean that there's not a 2011 thrown in there. It just means that those wet years are fewer and further between. And just for reference, since 2000 through the end of last year, average hydrology since 2000, I think, is about 12.1 million acres. So where we are today, or where we've been over the last 20 years, is sort of halfway between that 11 and 13. And I'll mention that again as we move through this.
So John, did your phase 4 reanalysis of the consumptive use, particularly on the tributaries during dry years, did that up the annual flows?
Yes. Yeah, so without getting into too much detail, the CRSS, just to indicate how sort of coarse CRSS is, all of the water users in the main stem of the Upper Colorado are represented by a handful, half a dozen nodes and water users, right? And so, and there's no real tributary, right? There is no Williams Fork, there's no Dillon There was no, you know, Fraser, there's, you know, none of that was in the model. And so, so what the model did was essentially come up with a way to approximate how tributary shortages manifest themselves in drier years. And that was implemented in the model. All of that, which in turn resulted in a higher incidence of shortages to those water users. And ultimately more water flowing downstream. Yeah. Because you know, there's, as you are all more aware than I am, there's quite often a mismatch between the location of the flow and the location of the head gate. And the timing of those things. And so, yeah, so all of this resulted in more water going downstream than was previously seen in the model. Everything else being so first I want to focus, and again, focusing first on this big chunk of potential future growth with the Trans Mountain diversions. I'm going to show several plots like this, so let me just take a minute to describe what this is showing. From left to right, you've got 3 different sets of hydrology: 13 million acre foot average, 11 million acre foot, and 9 million acre feet. The blue represents current demands. The orange is the forecast future demands. And again, these are using the UCRC demand schedule. And in this case, we're looking at average annual depletions by TMDs under these different hydrologies. So if we take a look at the first pairing there under the stress test, or the 13 million acre foot hydrology, you can see that the model says that under current conditions can average a little less than 550,000 acre feet a year. Under future demands, that bumps up to a little over 600,000 acre feet a year. And a little bit of a look ahead, but recall that the forecast actually calls for an additional 200,000 acre feet of demands, right? So in spite of that significant increase in demand, we're only seeing roughly 60 to 70,000 acre feet of actual increased depletions. And as you would expect, as the hydrology goes down, the depletions are going to go down as well.
The demands will still be the same.
The demands will still be the same, but the actual availability of water will significantly decrease. And you can see over there at the 9 million acre foot future, there's going to be a lot of shortages.
Is that shortage attributable to administration within the state of Colorado based on priority system just within the state? Or
yeah, it's a combination of things. So it's meeting the Shoshone and Grand Valley calls, essentially, which are built into the CRSS model, and it's also simply just a lack of water availability. I mean, those two things combined, right?
But you're not assuming interstate administration.
No interstate. There's no compact related curtailments or other activities with this. No. Yeah. So as you have already alluded to, as people alluded to here, obviously those demands haven't gone down, but the shortages have gone way up, and you can see that here. So, you know, and even under our current conditions and the current hydrology, there are going to be some shortages. There are shortages. You know, the TMDs aren't able to. They're not able to fill those reservoirs every single year, and they wouldn't be able to take all the water they needed every single year. That's not a surprise. But what you see is, not surprisingly, over time, even if the demands don't grow, as hydrology gets worse, you're going to have increasing shortages. And this is, you know, something that's this isn't unique to TMDs. I mean, if the hydrology goes to 9 million acre feet, the upper basin is not going to be consuming anywhere near 4 million acre feet a year. Might be lucky to get to 3 million acre feet a year. So this isn't surprising. What is interesting in this particular analysis, so we wanted to understand how the reservoirs were behaving, or this new reservoir in CRSS was behaving. So really what what CRSS does is it takes Granby and Dillon and Homestake and it combines those, and the combined sort of usable storage or conservation storage of those three reservoirs. I think actually there as well, but it's fairly small compared to these three. But anyway, the total volume there is 760,000, a little over 760,000 acre feet of potential storage that could be used on a regular basis. And what this is showing is the average storage volume under these different scenarios, so different hydrologies, different demands. And the thing that really sticks out right away is that on the far left there, where we are today with today's hydrology, the reservoirs are able to stay, relatively full on average, 80 to 90% of capacity on average. As the hydrology gets worse, and as demands increase, those storages drop precipitously. And I think that what's going on there is that, there really is sort of a tipping point. If you look at the nature of those water rights being junior, the nature of demands in the basin, as those TMD demands increase and as the hydrology, assuming the hydrology continues to dry out, they're going to be relying more and more on storage to meet those demands. So those storage buckets are going to become more heavily used. They'll be trying to fill them when they can, but then they'll be draining them significantly to meet and if you look at a time series, I think that becomes a bit more obvious. So this is just looking at, as an example, just looking at the 11 million acre foot hydrology. So this is a little drier than we've been in the millennial drought, but what it really shows is that even under current demands, which are shown there in blue, average storage of those reservoirs is going to drop because they're going to have to start taking more and more water out of storage. So they're going to have less and less in reserve. And as the demands increase even more, you can see that storage drops really precipitously. And in fact, you're going to see very little storage on average in those reservoirs.
And so what about wet slope storage that not impacted as much by growth in demand, but certainly the hydrology is the same? What happens to west slope storage?
Well, unfortunately, there aren't many west slope storage buckets in the model, but they also suffer. I mean, they're also, you're going to see a reduction in those storage reservoirs as well. Certainly, if you get down, to a 9 million acre foot future, and we see that in the big reservoirs too, right? Powell and Flaming Gorge and Navajo. Okay, so just a few takeaways on that particular piece. Right now, demands and hydrology being what they have been over the last 20 to 30 years is more or less sustainable. As demands increase, particularly those junior demands, and as hydrology decreases, you're going to see a reduction in yield by those TMDs. And the higher the demand goes, the larger the shortages are going to be. The lower the hydrology goes, the higher the shortages are going to be. In fact, even if you look at a 9 million acre foot type of hydrology under their current demands, you're still going to see a significant amount of shortage for those TMDs. And anybody who's very junior. So that's a short look at that significant chunk of future demands. Also want to take a look at a bit more broadly, take a step back and look at upper basin demands as a whole, and increases in upper basin demands that are anticipated through the UCRC demand schedules. Take a look at current conditions, take a look at what the risk is of reaching certain critical thresholds that we've all become intimately familiar with in the last several years. And then also take a look at how much water might be required to maintain Powell at 3,500. And again, we're looking at really a current conditions set of demands and then this forecasted future demands for the UCRC based on a 30-year horizon. So first off, and I said this at the outset, risk is still the primary driver. I'm sorry, hydrology is still the primary driver of risk. This is a time series of average Lake Powell pool elevations into the future. Minimum power pool at 3490, which I think we're all familiar with now, and 3 different sets of hydrology. And as you can see up there, where we'd like to be in the green is a continuation of the hydrology since 1988, where things are not great, but we're okay. You know, Lake Powell could actually recover on average from where it is right now. 11 and 9 million acre foot futures, though, are pretty bleak under our current set of demands and the way that the system is being operated right now. And I should mention, all of these simulations assume that the interim guidelines continue into the future. And so while that may not necessarily, I hope, doesn't come to fruition, this does serve, in addition to just looking at the risk across these different demands and hydrologies, I think it also serves as a warning as to some of the inefficiencies or ineffectiveness of the guidelines themselves in terms of protecting the upper basin.
I wonder what the lake levels would look like if the lower basin even does what they're currently talking about as a million acre foot reduction annually. What would that make the lake level look like?
You know, it would probably impact them a little bit, but maybe not as much as you'd expect. I mean, this has the DCP and the guideline shortages built into it. So, you know, it would move the needle a little bit, but primarily only over the first few years.
So that's what we in the upper basin need to be plugging is what you're proposing, a million acre foot reductions is, if hydrology turns out like it's predicted, is not going to be enough.
They need that. They need to do that every year, not just when things are bad, right?
Yeah, every year.
Yeah. And even then, that may not be enough at times. Yeah. But a good year helps, right? So, and a little bit tongue in cheek, but you know, this is where we are now. We're all the way up to 3580 something, right, at Lake Powell. But you know, there's 2 things with risk and looking at how systems behave. You know, we're very focused on near-term risk right now and what's going to happen over the next few years, you know, because we are sort of in a crisis situation, or I should say maybe reclamations in the lower basin are in a crisis situation. You know, so a good year helps in the near term, but over time, as you can see, it really doesn't matter where you start, right? The fact that we started these simulations at a very low elevation, and if you start them at a high elevation over time, you'll still see these same patterns emerge, right? You'll still see the long-term averages more or less where they are. And so from a long-term planning perspective, it's important to keep in mind that and to separate that from sort of the near-term risk. And what are we going to do today to fix the problem in the near term? In the long term, we really need to be thinking, what's a sustainable level of demand, and be able to be adjusting that depending on what hydrology and Mother Nature deals. So, having said that, hydrology matters the most, but demands do matter. So a couple of slides here just to illustrate that. This is the stress test hydrology, 13 million acre feet a year. And this is 2020 demands and 2050 demands. Okay, so the dark is where we are today in terms of demands in the basin. The light green is what Lake Powell would look like under the forecasted demands at 2050. So you see a fairly significant decrease in average elevation if the upper basin, in fact, starts to have another 600,000 or 700,000 acre feet of consumptive use every year. on average. Similarly, this is the 11 million acre foot future. The demands don't seem to matter quite as much. There's not quite as much of a gap. And that's simply because there's not enough water to satisfy the demands even today at the 20, at the 11 million acre foot level. So, and if we get all the way to 9 million acre feet, well, I guess all bets are off, because where we are, even with demands in the upper basin where they are today, Lake Powell's going to be in a bad situation. So demands do matter,
And is this graph, is it assuming that lower basin demands are staying the same as they are today?
Yes, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But yes, and assuming that the interim guidelines continue. Right. So this doesn't have any adjustment for might call it an equitable sharing of the shortage, right? So we're assuming that the lower basin is going to try to continue to consume. We're assuming that Lake Powell would continue to release 7 million acre feet at a bare minimum, which with a 9 million acre foot hydrology isn't realistic. So again, that's all those charts just thrown together, but the demands do make a difference. It's not as obvious as the hydrology, but increasing demands do have an effect over time, and it's something we all just need to be aware of. So again, same sort of format for these plots, but this is looking at current demands and future demands in the entire upper basin, and what we would expect Lake Powell to be at. As you can see, even under future demands, Lake Powell can on average stay above minimum power if we have hydrology that we've had since 1988. Right? And again, in the last 20 some odd years, we're about 1 million acre feet less than that. So at 11 million acre feet, that's not sustainable under either current or future demands. And like I say, we're somewhere in between. So we really are sort of at this threshold of sustainability right now with where we've been over the last 25 years and where our demands are. And I think you're seeing the types of crises you're seeing right now where we get down close to minimum power pool and the lower basin needs to take dramatic action. But those are the kinds of things you'd expect just maintaining status quo moving forward. So. This is the 10-year compact volumes on average at Lee Ferry. And I think this really speaks to the issue of the guidelines themselves, because one of the things you'll notice here is that where we've been and where we're operating, we still have a compact credit, even relative to the 82.5 million acre foot over 10-year requirement, which is not really a requirement, and that includes Mexico's half of the Mexico deficit. But if you look at 75 million acre foot as being a more realistic, I think, and certainly a defensible level of flows past Lee Ferry, we are and will likely continue to be well above that for quite some time. And so again, when we're talking about the Upper Basin's obligations and how the interim guidelines act, and how the interim guidelines have really, I think it's fair to say, over-delivered relative to the compact. It just highlights the need to have a different paradigm moving forward for operations of Powell.
Do those curves reflect the projected demands?
So again, yeah, I'm sorry. This is, so the darker colors are current demands and the lighter colors are the future demands. So the dark green is 2020, light green is 2050, okay. And that's both with the 13 million acre foot future on average. And the blue again is the 11. So dark blue is where we are today with demands. The light blue is where we would be in 2050. And so again, in terms of risk, it's not surprisingly if there's additional depletions in the upper basin, it's going to result in less water into Lake Powell on average, and it's going to result in less water going downstream on average, right? I mean, that's just, that's simple math on water use. Looking at the lower basin. So again, this is inclusive of the DCP and the shortages that are already built into the guidelines. But as you can see, it's a similar story for Lake Mead. Under current conditions and current demands, Lake Mead is sustainable, although I would note that that includes some built-in shortages already that they'll be required to take. And if you look out into the future, those shortages are going to increase fairly dramatically. 2 or 3 million acre feet every single year of shortages relative to their demands. So,
John, sorry, on the previous slide, the Lee Ferry volumes, was there a storage protection rule at PAL applied here? Are you protecting?
No, not in this particular case. No, but I will talk about that in a minute. So, yeah, no, this is just assuming that the interim guidelines proceed as defined, and the only difference being that if Lake Powell gets so low that it actually can't release water, so that through the turbines, in that situation you would just get, it'd release what it could basically physically based on the physical constraints, which is what you would see down on those red lines, right, where it's not physically able to release as much water as the guidelines say it should. Okay, Lake Mead, significant shortages to the lower basin. And to Peter's point, one last item here that I wanted to mention. So, there's been a lot of, I think, action, not just talk, but action by Reclamation to ensure that Lake Powell doesn't drop below hydropower pool. And Reclamation has stated they want to keep it above 3,500 feet elevation. So we wanted to take a quick look at that and say, well, what would it take to actually keep Lake Powell above 3,500 feet? And, again, how that happens, I'm not here to suggest, but, I think obviously there's the range of options we all are familiar with. Certainly under the drought response operations, they've been moving water out of Flaming Gorge and other reservoirs, Aspinall. But that's a temporary fix, right? That's a Band-Aid on a really bad cut. So it's not a permanent solution. So how much water would it take? Well, just where we are today. So this is current demands, where we are today. What would it take to keep Lake Powell at 3,500 foot elevation? Well, even under our current hydrology, you need a little bit of help, around 200,000 acre feet on average. And that's, sort of what we've seen with some of the modifications to Powell releases, the draw actions, moving water from those upper crisp reservoirs. As the hydrology worsens, it takes a lot more water. In other words, a lot less water used in the other basin. So we had a 11 million acre foot future. Every single year, we'd have to figure out how to get another 1 million acre feet into Lake Powell to preserve hydropower. So that's a lot of water. And I'm not suggesting that's going to come from the upper basin, but it's just an indication of two things. One, hydrology matters. And two, it's not, the current operations aren't sustainable under worsening hydrology. And there's got to be a change in the way that Powell is operated that is more reflective of the hydrology on the ground and what's going on. Similarly, you can see that if you look at the ferry, how much additional water that would yield at Lee Ferry. So if we are able to keep Lake Powell above 3,500, and again, under the guidelines, Lee Ferry would be much better off, as shown by those dashed lines. Again, not suggesting that's what we should be striving for in the upper basin, but it is an indication of the way the guidelines work. Maintaining Powell at 3,500 on average guarantees more than 75 million acre feet over 10 years. So again, there needs to be a change in the way that the reservoirs are operated.
Question over here.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm still figuring out the question. I got parts of it, but it's not complete, so I'm just gonna wing it. How about evaporation down there? You're looking at 200,000 acre feet of evaporation coming out of that bucket every year anyway. I mean, that doesn't take long to rack up 1 million acre feet. Are we looking at something that's in the right place?
In terms of, are you talking about putting water in Lake Powell?
Yeah, I mean, well, because I'm looking at it. Are we?
Sure.
I mean, we're not filling up some of our reservoirs upstream, like Blue Mesa has been low for years.
Right.
Well, would it be more advantageous to the system to actually store it up there than transport it downriver later on? Because you're looking at probably an evaporation rate that's probably half of what it is down there in Powell. So, I mean, that's one area that it's something to take a look at. I mean, that's probably a bigger picture question, but is that something to include within the model? I'm sure you got evaporation thrown in.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Because I think Powell and Meade together isn't like 600,000-700,000 acre feet a year between the two on evaporative losses.
Even more if they're full.
Yeah, and then let's throw in Mojave. Let's throw in Havasu. I mean, let's throw in the mud buckets. You're looking at 1 million acre feet. I think it's what, 1.4 million acre feet ish, just between those there a year.
Wow. Absolutely. I mean, I think there's reclamation made and the upper basin states to some extent through the DCP made this decision to prop up Lake Powell at the expense of other crisp reservoirs. We can talk about whether or not that was the right thing to do, but that's what happened, right? And,
yeah,
and that's because so there's two things there. One is, yeah, it doesn't make sense, right? I mean, that water would be you'd lose a lot less if it was upstream, not in Lake Powell. Number two, that water was moved down to Lake Powell under what I would call a faulty operational scheme, right? A scheme that has been shown now to not be very effective at protecting Lake Powell itself, and certainly not effective at protecting upper basin interests relative to 602A and other, legislated, the legislative CRISP project. So absolutely, that's a problem.
Well, it seems like we're gearing up here for another conversation with BORs and move along. But to me, operations of the upper crisp reservoirs is something that should be part of that consideration. Because even Flaming Gorge, I mean, they ran that down a little bit, not much, but still 25%. Well, I guarantee evap loss is way less up there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the CRISP Act was fairly clear, at least to me. I'm not an attorney, but was fairly clear about the one of the primary purposes, which was to maintain 602A storage, which is really to allow the upper basin to continue to take full advantage of its compact entitlement without putting it in jeopardy of not meeting its obligations at Lee Ferry. And there was no jeopardy at Lee Ferry, and yet water from those upper crisp reservoirs is being released down to Powell, and certainly some of it's either evaporating more than it otherwise would have, and some of it's going downstream, right, because of the guidelines. So I sense another question coming there.
Well, it's just modeling, and where does it end? I mean, you can keep adding nodes to it all you want. So
well, and where it, but all of this I think is just the purpose. I mean, it's modeling where does it end? Well, hopefully where it ends is having enough people understand the implications of the guidelines to be able to say, let's don't do that in 2026. Let's do something else.
Well, and that's where I look at
right. I mean,
SCPP on the impact that has on the system too. I mean, there's secondary impacts that aren't really being looked at, and that's a whole new piece to add to the model.
Right.
That 3,000 acre feet might be kind of small, but there might be other implications attached to it. So,
yeah, all of this I think is really, I mean, the whole purpose of this really is to be better informed than for the Upper Basin as a whole, to be better informed than collectively we were in 2007, and not, you know, at least not make the same mistakes again, and hopefully avoid making other mistakes. So. Okay, so almost there. I already told you these things, but I'll tell them to you again. Hydrology is still the #1 indicator, right? Especially in the short term. You know, this year's a perfect example. We've eliminated a lot of risks simply by having one good year. But in the long term, you know, hydrology, whatever it is, will be impacted by demands. You know, the biggest future chunk of demands is likely to be from trans mountain diversions. And that is not just Colorado, that's also certainly Utah, not so much New Mexico, a little bit Wyoming. But those shortages are going to increase. And that's not just unique to TMDs, all of those junior water users, any junior water users are likely to see a reduction in yield as the hydrology worsens, if the hydrology worsens.
So these TMDs that you have in here are ones that are currently operable and that are drawing water, TMDs. They're not
under the current conditions. Yes, that's correct.
They do not include the new ones that are planned for it, permitted.
Yeah, so the 2020 condition is where we are today with demands. Those 2050 lots I was showing you, that's all of those new permitted. That means, you know, Windy Gap is fully online, Moffat's online.
So is that all of them, or is that include an allowance for additional?
Well, it includes an allowance for additional as well.
Oh, wow.
And that's per.
So it includes the permitted ones, and then it also includes an allowance for future not planned or permitted.
Right. So again, this is just Colorado, but this is the UCRC schedule. And circled there in red, you can see that there's two different numbers there. There's export and potential export. Export, which jumps from 740 to 850, that's the biggest chunk of the increase of Colorado's demand as a whole. And that really includes the known projects, right? So that's full use of existing projects. That's Whitney on the Eagle. That's Moffat Gross Reservoir expansion. That's, you know, Windy Gap full use. Those are the big three, but there's other, you know, full utilization of other projects. And then there's on top of that another 75 that's a placeholder. and I don't know what that is.
So the only way that gets solved is through ag change, out of ag water.
More snow.
More snow.
More snow.
Okay.
Or changing the guidelines.
Yes. Part. And really, again, it's about hydrology, right? I mean, that's going to be the big. You have to have a system that's resilient in the sense of it being able to adapt to different hydrology. Because I think we're going to continue to see drying, but we're also going to continue every once in a while to see a year like this. So how do you deal with that? So sorry, let me just finish up here. Let's see. Export shortages will increase, as will shortages to junior water users. And increasing demands is going to increase the risk. I mean, it's simple math. Water consumed is water not going downstream past the ferry. regardless of what the operating policy is. And, and finally, just maintaining Lake Powell, preserving hydropower is going to take a lot of additional water unless we really change the operating regime and make it more amenable to the reality of changing climate and significant climate variability. So that's got to change. And not to put a damper on our wonderful hydrology here, but we're still in a drought. It's still dry out there, and those reservoirs are nowhere near full. So it's good in Colorado, but the Big River is still not well. Thank you. I hope that was useful.
Great, Director Curry.
Thank you. I have a question. Sorry, did I get somebody off? And thank you so much for this information. Is this type of information being used by the folks that are doing the 2007 guideline renegotiations? Does anybody know?
I hope so.
Do they have this? Are they getting this message about the way the existing guidelines are not sustainable?
Yes, they are. We've made virtually all of John's work on this. The risk study, it is public. It's part funded by the Bureau of Reclamation. We've made that public, and as this presentation obviously is, but we have offered our internal help, John's help.
So we could get a copy of.
Oh yeah. As well as, we might not have the budget or the funds allocated for John to make presentations on this to the constituent groups, but I think Andy and DK and others I can try to make the lawyer math work in my mind.
And not enough water.
And I think, John, I think your work is excellent. And I think as you would acknowledge, it can always be improved upon and refined. And so we welcome it's not putting this out there saying this is the final word. It's saying, hey, this is some work that our constituents, but the entire state and Upper Basin should be aware of. And how do we, did we miss something? Working through these issues with John, are we wrong in some of the assumptions or the operating criteria of interpretation? Because it isn't in our interest or anybody else's that we have information that's not the best available. And so, and I do think it's great work, John. I'm not criticizing. I want to make sure that everybody's aware.
One, I would just say it's nice that I think the River District has always been one of the leaders in terms of being transparent, certainly in terms of some groups. So, there's been varying levels from states and the UCRC in terms of how transparent they're willing to be for any number of different reasons. So the more information you can get out, the better, and have the conversation. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So the slide that had the leaf berry projections on when we could be out of compliance, that slide that you had up there. Can you tell me, John, off the top of your head, was that based on hydrology that was more recent than the state mod period?
Yes, so this hydrology includes, for our purposes, this was hydrology through 2021.
Okay. So that forecast was based on more recent.
So this is, yeah, and so those different, without getting into too much detail, so we used the hydrology from 1988 through, so say 2021, so I think that's the and when we developed these different traces, we basically, if you will, very crudely, we shuffled those hydrologies. So we reordered those, and that was done using a method that Jim Prairie from Reclamation developed 15 years ago. So when I say a 9 million acre foot future, that really is a bunch of different potential traces that all average 9 million acre feet. There's, so there's like in the 9 million acre foot example, you're going to get a lot more 2002s than you have 2011s, but they're going to be in there. But yeah, so it includes basically up through as recent as we could, the hydrology that we had.
Other questions, John? Yeah.
So good work, and I like the if then aspect. You know, if 13 million acre feet and increasing upper basin demands, then this is where we'll be. And if 11. But what I'd also think would be beneficial for the word picture and the presentation piece is if in the lower basin, if they reduce their demands by 1 million a year, then, and if they reduce by 2 million, then under the 11 and the 13, it seems like that would be a really useful.
Yes, an excellent point.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it's worth, you know, one of the things that, you know, there was a lot of concern back before the DCP was signed. There was really a lot of concern about what would happen as Lake Powell and Lake Mead dropped, because in the lowest of the operating tiers under the guidelines, it was possible for Lake Powell to actually start increasing more water, releasing more water. And one of the things we found was that that became much less of a risk if, and of course it happened, but once the DCP was in place. And it just has to do with the math of where the reservoirs are and the tiers and the balancing between Mead and Powell. So prior to that additional reduction in use in the lower basin, that was a very real issue, and it really did impact Lake Powell. It's still, I mean, where Lake Mead is still impacts Powell, but because of the DCP, that some of the edge has been taken off of that knife of really having a severe negative impact because of what the lower basin is. It's still there, but it's not what it was before the DCP.
Peter.
Yeah, I just wanted to make an observation, and John, if this is not correct, please correct me. But you know, the work assumes the interim guidelines stay in place, and what that shows is that under these bad hydrologies, the interim guidelines aren't going to work, particularly for the upper basin. And so there's potential work to be done about alternatives to the interim guidelines that would better protect the upper basin's interests in particularly in drought years or in extended drought periods or lower hydrology. But I hope that the work also sort of demonstrates that you can't get around the point that you're either storing more and therefore, you know, unless you have more precipitation, you're either protecting storage levels at Lake Powell and thus cutting Lee Ferry deliveries, or you are satisfying or padding Lee Ferry deliveries and storing less. I mean, there's no way around the mass balance, right? It's got to come out somewhere. So where that balance is, and the interim guidelines at the time were intended to achieve that balance, right? People in the upper basin wouldn't have agreed to them had we not thought that was, you know, was going to work. So, you know, if you can't do that with whatever renegotiation, or if you know, as much as you can hope to get the best result out of a renegotiation of the interim guidelines, you're still going to have to think about hoping to get more precipitation, or think about, you know, the fact that there may have to be less consumption in the basin.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything else for John? Let's take a quick break and then we'll come back and finish our executive session.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention for some of our guests, because we didn't finish all of the subject matters in our executive session, we are going to go back in for probably half hour, 45 minutes?
Hopefully less, because I know that we're going to ask John Karen to join us for part of that. And I know he needs to get to a important birthday party for a daughter.
All right, so that's, so there will be a half hour in there or less where we will unfortunately be back in executive session. So I apologize to our guests and anybody online who's guests.
Thanks, Andy. So 5 minutes so we can respect John's time, stand up and stretch.
I would make a recommendation that the board reconvene into executive session pursuant to CRS section 24-6-402 4B and E to discuss that item as agenda item 3A Romanet 9. And I'd also note that we've invited John Karen to participate in part of that discussion as part of a product that we asked John to help us with.
All right, do we have a motion?
So moved.
Motion by Vandenbrink, second by Richard. Executive session as soon as we get.
And I would state for the record before we turn off the recording that the substance in the attorney-client in executive session will constitute attorney-client communications for which no further recording needs to be made. And we will just wait till folks get moved.
Okay,
all right, Peter, you want to get us back out of executive?
Sure, I'll wait till we get the people that are in the waiting room.
If there's still anybody waiting outside, if someone can take the notices out the door and open it up.
All guests are back in the meeting. We did that.
So during the executive session, we are back in public session. During the executive session portion of the board's reconvening into executive session, the board discussed with staff and council a subject on its agenda tab 3A Romanet 9. And I don't believe there was any matter proposed for action coming out of that discussion. I don't have anything further this time.
Thank you very much. And that takes us through, we covered the public session, so that takes us to the general manager's report.
Okay, thank you. And we're just going to take the general manager's report in order until you tell us it's time for dinner. And I actually, I mean, just to be fair to the directors, dinner is scheduled for what time? 6? 6. And I imagine that you'll want to check into your hotel and then come back. So, Madam President, what time would you like us to?
Let's go until 5:15.
5:15.
Is that acceptable?
Okay. You now have an actual solid time limit to your presentation.
You want me to use up every?
If you can use up less, that would be phenomenal. But I've never seen the two of you.
So there's no pitch talk.
5:15. All right.
All right.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. as is our habit, we're going to kind of bring you up to speed or give you a status update of what's going on hydrologically speaking in the Colorado River Basin. It's kind of redundant for you all who live this every day. So some of the things you're going to see are pretty obvious, but we put them in graphical form for your pleasure. And we start with the headlines. And the headline is From Drought Recovery into the Fire. So we had an amazing spring. We all know that. Wet and cool, above average, and a spectacular recovery of all reservoirs, some of which were at record low. Most went from almost empty to fill and spill. That means Lakes Powell and Meade had significant gains. They did not fill and spill, but significant gains. Lake Powell up 60 feet. It's now at its seasonal high and starting to go down because the peak inflows, of course, have gone by the wayside, but the releases are continuing through the Grand Canyon down to Lake Meade. Lake Meade, you know, it's really a success for Lake Meade is a stable reservoir level, and that's where they're at right now. For this year, 2023, water year, you know, it's super hot, and most climatologists are blaming this on El Nino. Keep in mind, that talks about the ocean temperatures in the Eastern Pacific. Previous to this year, they were cooler than normal, and now they're way hotter than normal. That leads to significantly high air temperatures. And all around us, we were kind of in a bubble this spring, but it's been hot, and around the world, I read about this, breaking records. When you look at average global temperature, we've never seen it this hot. And in the lower basin, our friends in Phoenix, who we just entertained up here from Central Arizona, seeing 20 straight days of 110 degrees Fahrenheit. So that they're setting records as well. That's all kind of the overprint onto a really good water year. Again, the water year forecast, which goes through for us in the upper basin through the end of September, 144%, almost 14 million acre feet of unregulated inflow. That's as if no reservoirs were here and no depletions, right? No exports. So the actual observed is much lower than that. That's what they use to model. And that's what brought, when you plug it into the interim guidelines that we talk about all the time, the lower basin is now in tier 2A shortage in 2023 today. Next year, the models suggest, and this will be formalized next month in the August 24-month study, that those shortages will be less in the lower basin next year because we're releasing more water out of Lake Powell. And as we heard also, they had 1.2 million acre feet of side inflows into Lake Meade, which is a huge number for them. In Western Colorado here, we're meeting our water demands. There are some shortages and tributary calls, but for the most part, we are free from main stem calls. This is the most boring slide you're going to see, so take a good look at it because it won't be here for long. There is no drought in Colorado today. This is an amazing recovery, as I said. If you look at this table, a year ago, this time, almost 100% of the state was in drought under these categories under the U.S. Drought Monitor. So pretty amazing. Again, we're probably not going to see this next year. There'll be red and yellow back on this map for sure. And if you look across the basin, you're seeing red and yellow downstream. And it's all related to what we saw for precip. This map, again, kind of captures precip as percent of normal pretty much through today. And you can see several things pop out. The east slope in particular, in some places almost 300% of average. We had an amazing May soon and June soon, you know, way wet across the states. forecasts are not good for our normal monsoon, but we'll see what happens. So again, soil moisture is up. Because of this, demands are down. Dawn's going to talk about that. With a wet east slope, that means less transbasin exports. When you look at, again, before recovery, the teacup diagram, thanks to our friend back here, Lindsay. She updates this on a regular basis. This is the old one, and then you quickly see some recovery as you toggle through the 2 dates, right? April, whoops, excuse me, I'm sorry, and June. July would show almost the same, again, seasonal highs. So good recovery there. When you look at it graphically speaking for Lake Powell, again, we're off the chart before this occurred. Now, luckily, with the 60 feet of gain, we're back on the chart with respect to average percentiles and millions of acre feet in storage at Lake Powell. This is a very confusing plot. You've seen it before, and Dawn's going to show you a few more. So I'm just going to talk to you about it a little briefly. Left-hand side, volumes anticipated. These are forecasts. This is what the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center puts out there in blue and purple. This is anticipating the runoff, right? This chart, this trace, excuse me. What you're seeing here in this brownish color in this ramp is what has flowed into Lake Powell, okay? And you can see they come together because we're at the end of the runoff season. The green lines here are average and we're well above average. For the runoff season, about 167% or 175% of median. So just really good news. It's what Dawn and I look at on a regular basis and other water managers. And so a lot of information here, but just shows again, here in the springtime, we saw a huge jump based on snowpack. And once the snow season kind of plateaus and you get into the snow melt, your forecast is not changing a lot. And the good news again in the spring, pretty efficient runoff, not a lot of losses across the basin as your water is flowing from the high country down to Lake Powell. So now when you try to model all this stuff for the next 2 years, this is output, the reclamation for the 2 big reservoirs, Lake Powell and Meade, and end of month elevations. In black, this is where we are today. And what you have also is broken up into these different operating tiers. Each tier means different things for operations. And we're looking out in the dashed lines in sort of this envelope of uncertainty. The green line is what they call the most probable trace. And the good news is it's above the mid elevation release tier where we have been, moving up into the upper elevation balancing tier. And we are talking about balancing between Powell and Meade and how the operations are set basically 12 to 24 months ahead of time. The interesting thing here, if you can see my cursor, when we come to the deciding point for next year, we're right on the boundary between the 2 elevation release tiers. That means there's some uncertainty on whether we will release for next year, 2024, 7.5 million acre feet or greater, okay? So it comes with some expenses. The higher it goes, the more they release, okay? Right now, their projection is that we're just below that break point. So they're projecting, and this model suggests 7.5 million acre feet next year of release. If it goes above that, their release will be increased and all bets are off. That all gets decided next month. When you look at Lake Meade, again, remember we're talking about stable reservoirs is a good thing for Lake Meade. That's really all they want. They want their water to come in and go out and meet their demands. It's going up slightly, but you can see over time, it's not sustainable. And it's bouncing up and around through their same thing. These different tiers, shortage tiers. Right now they're level 2, right here today, where my cursor is. Next year, they will be more than likely in a lesser shortage criteria. So that means they will take less water. I'm sorry, they will be able to take more water, okay? So good news for them, maybe not so good news for the system, because the more they take, the lower the elevations go. And those can, again, through the existing operating criteria, cause more water to be released from Lake Powell. So I think everybody's got that, but it's an interesting tightrope that we're all walking. So what does that mean for our compact compliance and our what we call Colorado River Compact Accounting? How much water's going past Lee Ferry? Again, a complicated plot. The left-hand side are these lines. Red line is what we are releasing, the long-term or progressive 10-year running average. We want that to be above 75 million acre feet, shown in purple, and we're well above that. We're well above the minimum. We've heard about 8.23 million acre feet. If you include half of the Mexican deficits, as we say in the compact, that would be 8.23 or 82 million acre feet. We're well above that. So that's the good news. Again, well within compliance and with a buffer above these lines, even if we go to 7.5 million acre feet in the next 2 years. In yellow, those are projected, right? This is where we are today, 2023. So we can breathe easily that there is no chance or very little chance of violating the compact as it's written, unless something changes in the operation. Keep in mind, this is what they're looking at under the supplemental environmental impact study that's going on now. Okay. All right, there's a whole mouthful there, and that's the big picture. Now we want to turn it over to my colleague here. Don's going to talk about what it means for local issues here in the headwaters area in their districts.
Thanks, DK. A lot of numbers here. The dark blue are current inflow forecasts, April through July, by the River Forecast Center, and then in Perrin in red are the April 1 forecasts. So for instance, Granby, 3 months ago was at 104% of average inflow forecast. I think they were forecasting something like 40,000 acre feet of spill. Yesterday was 116% of average runoff forecast, and they've already spilled about 50,000 acre feet. Willow Creek likewise came up in 3 months and has spilled already about 38,000 acre feet. Now that, I think they were talking about just 10,000 acre feet of spill back in April projection. So we've got a bunch of water coming over out of these Trans Mountain facilities due to, and we'll see in a little bit, lack of tunnel activity because of moisture on the Front Range. Williams Fork at 106%, it has filled. Of course, you might recall back in April, it was dicey, kind of on the bubble as to whether it would fill. Wolford, even though the forecast went down, we were able to actually spill 20,000 acre feet. Actually through the runoff, not so much recently. Dillon has spilled about 46,000 acre feet. Again, Dillon was kind of on the bubble. All this spill activity really in the Trans Mountain facilities are due to the lack of demand on them. So we'll see that here in a second. Green Mountain, the forecast came up to 94% of average. They've actually spilled, this is a swag, 78,000 acre feet, maybe a little less depending on what they might have been able to put through the turbines. Had the east slope not got so much full. Roaring Fork at 122%, Root Eye has spilled a little bit on the way. Cameo at 129, Elkhead, Elkhead really took a hit in May, about 30,000 acre feet less forecast first and June 1st. But of course, we filled and spilled rather quickly there, about 2,000 CFS instantaneous there. We'll see on the graph. in the future here. The Yampa at 147%, White 152% of average. Gunnison at 166. Blue Mesa 133% is currently at 91% full. DK will talk about that here in a little bit. Taylor Park 126% infill. All these numbers are really gorgeous. Dolores, I know we're getting away from our district here, but 214% of average. That was down from 237% of average in April. San Juan at 167%. Navajo Reservoir is 76% full currently. And Lake Powell at 177, whoops, it was April 177% down to 166%. That's the ESP. Here's a couple of monthly precipitation maps. June precipitation was, again, you recall DK's statewide map. This obviously the blues bleed over into the eastern part of the state in big way. But this just shows you how wet June was, at least locally here, not so much to the south. And then, conversely, July, we've hit the wall here. Percent of precipitation is well below average. To the south of us, 0 to 30% average. So far, horrible first 2/3 of the month. So here's the lack of diversion at 4 different locations, right? The upper left is Moffett Tunnel. Those diversions were almost eliminated initially due to the gross reservoir expansion, and then subsequently they were able to pick up East Slope priority water, and they actually shut off the tunnel for a couple months there, a month and a half. Upper right, you can see that East Slope priority water caused them to shut that diversion off entirely for a couple months. The lower left is Adams Tunnel. Again, East Slope priority water kept the demands low, as well as, of course, all that water that they received from the heavens. And then the lower right, Twin Lakes Tunnel, which impacted the Roaring Fork through Aston and on down. Only for a couple of weeks, but you can see that they stopped diverting there in late June. The result, just below these diversions, on the Fraser, you can see they peaked at over 1,000 CFS on June 9th. Below, again, upper right, below Roberts Tunnel, we have the Blue River at about 1,000 CFS below Dillon, and then 1,750 CFS, believe it or not, below Green Mountain in late June. So that all of these really stemming from lack of demand on East Slope really caused our rivers to blossom. Granby spills totaled, again, I think 60,000 acre feet, and its Tahiti is 2,000 CFS on June 23rd. And Lincoln Creek below Grizzly Reservoir benefited from shutting off the Twin Lakes Tunnel. And currently they're in their that Twin Lakes Exchange operation at about 40 CFS. So looking downstream on the Colorado, upper left Kremling, those sort of late season bypasses caused a seasonal peak of it's like 5,000 CFS maybe. So really not expected. And then going across to upper right, Docero, again caused a seasonal peak late in June due to these Trans Mountain spills. Lower left, Cameo, actually we almost attained a seasonal peak due to these spills. The actual peak was back in early May, I believe, about 16,000 CFS, 16.9, and then we had about 16,300 CFS. So really bolstered the river later than we anticipated. And state line, lower right, again, you know, all these Trans Mountain spills really benefited the river all the way down past 15-mile reach and into Utah. Really later than we anticipated, and certainly later than the normal season. And on the Roaring Fork, interesting through Aspen here, how those bypasses at the Twin Lakes Tunnel really impacted flows there. And the seasonal peak is quite obvious there. And it actually caused a seasonal peak down at Glenwood Springs on the Roaring Fork, about 5,300 CFS, I believe. So that Twin Lakes spill actually caused the seasonal peak to be much later than the top here. Yeah. So here's a glimpse at the enterprise operations at Wolford. I'm so happy to be full here. We have dam safety concerns. We had a consensus with the state, with Denver Water, to go ahead and fill the reservoir after our investigation mostly in the lab this spring. So here we are at right at full. Right now we're right at the spillway lip, releasing about 35 CFS. Last year we did not attain a fill. That's the lower brown open circle brown there. We were about 7 feet down from full last year. So we came up from about 21 feet down to fill this year. Again, we had plenty of inflow, spilled about 20,000, but we're very pleased. Water supply on the Yampa, Elkhead Creek, like we had mentioned earlier, we lost about 30,000 acre feet of anticipated inflow during the month of May. So you can see we went from, earlier slides showed 215% of average forecast, and we're looking at about 170% average when all is said and done. And then on the right, the Yampa evolving forecast also lost. Actually, it looks like it might have gained during the month of May. So other portions of the Yampa must have fared better in terms of the forecast. 147% of the averages is where we're going to wind up there about at Mayville. Here's the flow graphs for Mayville and Deer Lodge Park. I think in April we had anticipated that Deer Lodge, that gauge Deer Lodge, Lily Park would eclipse the flood stage, and it turned out it did not. No flooding at forecast or actual flooding at Mayville. I think 15,000 and Deer Lodge at about 20,000. So another enterprise operation at Elkhead. Again, we filled very quickly with about 1,900 CFS coming in on a couple of different occasions. That's the blue trace red on the left axis. The storage shows a spill late April and sustained, and we're down from the spillway right now. We're releasing, I think, 7 CFS. We just made a big change this morning. I don't think there's much in the way of, haven't been much in the way of diversions below the reservoir, at least recently. So that's why we're right at 7 CFS, just below actually. On to DK, talk about the Gunnison.
Yeah, the Gunnison, pretty interesting year. Again, we heard, or I mentioned that amazing recovery. This is down below Blue Mesa, pretty much at the head of the Black Canyon. And you'll see a kind of a weird looking hydrograph with 2 humps. Obviously, this is because of the influence of the operations, but the first one is based on high releases to meet the flow recommendations. Remember the fish flow recommendations? We have near Grand Junction, the first seasonal peak. And due to flooding concerns, they couldn't necessarily meet the Black Canyon water right. So later in the year, they had to ramp back up, and they did so here in late June. And it just so happened that we had a tour of the Central Arizona project that you'll hear about tomorrow morning. And those folks got to experience a really 1 out of 10 year kind of event when Morro Point spilled through their gates, causing this huge waterfall. It's really impressive. And I think Raquel will share some photos of that tomorrow. So really interesting story, interesting year. You know, the Gunnison, and you heard about the Southwest, really had a great snowpack, good runoff, captured in Blue Mesa, and then re-timed and released, reoperated to meet dual purpose or multiple benefits downstream, full Gunnison tunnel. The fish got what they needed under the fish flow and the record of decision. That's a requirement that reclamation has to meet essentially for an alternative there too. And then also the Black Canyon got what they needed under that settlement. So a really good story this year, and the reservoir still near full. An amazing situation that I guess Mother Nature provided, and reclamation through their operations was able to make happen. And if you look to the right, it just shows downstream those same impacts of operations of 2 peaks. The second peak attenuated somewhat due to water use and some losses, but again, an amazing story right here that we wanted to tell.
That's a bad thing when the CAP came out and we were doing that. Doesn't that happen every year?
Well, you know, we're sending them water. That actually was all going right to them, so they should be happy.
Really fascinating. And this trace, or this plot again just shows that spectacular recovery, you know, near record low, and then all of a sudden the inflows and you're almost full. This doesn't happen. It wasn't anticipated. It's really an amazing tale. When last time we were in record low, it took 3 to 5 years to recover like this. As we go forward here, we're near the end here. I'm going to leave a few extra minutes, but you know, the left-hand side, the temperatures that we're feeling and are projected to continue at least for the next 2 weeks, breaking records across the desert Southwest into Texas and some other hot spots. The good news maybe is that hopefully that's going to spark some, I shouldn't use the word spark, but some precipitation through uplift and moisture coming from the west, not from the normal Gulf kind of monsoonal flow. It's a different flow, but maybe we'll get a little bit of rain is what they're forecasting here in the next 2 weeks. When you pull the lens back at a longer seasonal outlook, it's still going to be hot. And the signal is for dry here in, again, Arizona, where normally they benefit from the monsoonal flow. The forecasters are not seeing that. So hot and dry in Arizona, don't want to be visiting our friends down there. But the good news is maybe this white spot here means a little bit of average precip that we can experience in Colorado, let's hope. And so we flew through that, and we're happy to entertain discussion or let you off a little early to
5 minutes to spare. Good job. No questions for today?
If there are no questions, I just have one.
Okay. Thank you very much. And we expect good news reports like that every time.
Yeah, keep it coming.
Yeah.
Did want to recall, I thought there was some engineer who told me that Blue Mesa stood a chance of never filling again. So it's it's good. I wanted to introduce the board to Cindy Kloeb. Cindy is our new contract and records administrator. She comes to us from the city of Aspen. She has really been delightful to have on the team already, and we're really excited. My understanding is Cindy will be at dinner, so I would encourage the board to introduce themselves. And Cindy, they're really nice people. Yeah.
Welcome. The only when they leave. All right, we are on break then until tomorrow morning at 8:30 and dinner here at 6 o'clock.
Yep, here on the backyard. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Backyard will not be turf.
Right, well, there'll be a small patch.
All right.
Yes.
Here.